The desert sun had not yet cleared the eastern ridgeline when Captain Elena Graves climbed into the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II at Bagram Air Base. The pre-dawn darkness was cold in the way that only Afghan mountain air could be cold, a dry, bone-deep chill that settled into the metal of the aircraft and made the handholds sting against her bare fingers. She pulled herself up the boarding ladder with the practiced ease of 3 years and 900 combat hours, swung her legs over the side rail, and dropped into the ejection seat that had become more familiar to her than any piece of furniture she had ever owned. The cockpit smelled the way it always smelled, hydraulic fluid and ozone and the faint chemical tang of the oxygen system. It was the smell of a machine built for one thing only: close air support, the protection of American soldiers on the ground by an aircraft so heavily armed and so brutally armored that pilots had given it the most unglamorous nickname in military aviation: the Warthog. Ugly, slow by fighter standards, and absolutely devastating to anything unfortunate enough to be on the wrong end of the 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in its nose. Elena ran her hands across the instrument panel in the darkness, touching switches and gauges from memory, beginning the pre-flight sequence that she could perform blindfolded. The ritual of preparation calmed her the way prayer calms a believer, which was appropriate because for Elena Graves, this cockpit was the closest thing she had to a church. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out a photograph, creased and faded from handling. A man in his early 30s stood beside a fighter jet on a sunlit tarmac, his flight helmet tucked under one arm and a grin on his face that radiated the particular confidence of a military pilot who believed he was immortal. Colonel Thomas Graves, United States Air Force, her father. The photograph had been taken in 1989 at Kunsan Air Base in South Korea, during one of the countless deployments that had defined his career and eventually consumed it. He had been a fighter pilot for 22 years, flying combat missions and operations that remain classified. And when the flying stopped, when his body was finally grounded by age and accumulated damage, the silence that replaced the engine roar had been too much for him. He turned to bourbon, then to isolation. He died when Elena was 14, in a Veterans Affairs hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and surrender. Elena taped the photograph to the instrument panel, just below the heads-up display, where it would catch her eye during quiet moments. She did not talk to the photograph. She did not believe the dead could hear the living. But the image grounded her. It reminded her of why she flew and what flying could cost, and the difference between surviving a war and coming home from one. There was another reason the photograph mattered today. 11 months ago, Elena had failed. The mission had been routine: overwatch for a foot patrol from the 101st Airborne Division moving through the Korengal Valley. Elena had been orbiting at 15,000 feet when the call came. Troops in contact. The patrol had been ambushed, 3 soldiers pinned down by concentrated fire. The JTAC, the Joint Terminal Attack Controller responsible for coordinating air support, had been killed in the opening volley, and the surviving soldiers were calling for help on an unsecured frequency with imprecise coordinates. Elena had needed 2 minutes to sort the confusion, verify the position, and begin her attack run. In that time, 3 American soldiers died. The investigation cleared her. The fault lay with the loss of the JTAC and the confused communications. No one blamed Captain Graves. No one except Captain Graves. She carried those 3 names in a small notebook in her flight suit pocket. Specialist James Henley, 22, from Tulsa. Private First Class Miguel Santos, 20, from El Paso. Corporal David Whitfield, 24, from Savannah. She had been their guardian angel in the sky, and she had arrived too late, and that failure lived inside her like a second heartbeat. Today's mission was supposed to be simple: overwatch for a Navy SEAL reconnaissance team in a remote valley near the Pakistani border. The briefing had used the word routine 3 times, and each time Elena had felt the word scrape against something raw inside her. In Afghanistan, routine was a lie that the schedule told you before the mountains taught you the truth. She started both General Electric TF-34 turbofan engines and felt the aircraft come alive around her. Elena keyed her radio. Bagram Tower Lightning 6, ready for taxi. 43 miles to the northwest, at Forward Operating Base Wolverine, Lieutenant Commander Daniel Reeves stood in the Tactical Operations Center and studied a map of the valley system that his team would enter in 6 hours. The map was overlaid with satellite imagery and intelligence annotations that marked suspected enemy activity in red. There was a lot of red. Reeves was 38 years old, with the lean, weathered look of a man whose body had been shaped by 2 decades of the most demanding physical training the United States military could devise. He had enlisted in the Navy at 18, 3 days after watching the Twin Towers fall on a television in his parents' living room in Beaumont, Texas. His father was a welder at the Motiva oil refinery. His mother was a nurse at Baptist Hospital. They were working people who understood duty not as an abstraction, but as something you got up and did every morning, whether you felt like it or not. Daniel Reeves had gotten up every morning for 18 years and done his duty, and the accumulated weight of that duty was written in the scars on his body and the persistent headache behind his left eye that he had told almost no one about. The headache had started 8 months ago after an IED detonation during a patrol in Helmand Province. The blast had knocked him unconscious for 90 seconds. He had been diagnosed with a mild concussion and returned to duty after 48 hours. Standard protocol. What was not standard was the headache that never fully went away. Some days it was barely noticeable. Other days, it was a spike of white-hot pain that blurred his vision and made him grip whatever was nearest until it passed. He had not reported the ongoing symptoms. Reporting meant evaluation. Evaluation meant potential removal from operational status. Removal meant leaving his team, and Daniel Reeves did not leave his team. He turned from the map and looked at the 6 men who would follow him into the valley. Chief Petty Officer Nathan Cole sat in the corner cleaning his Mk-13 sniper rifle with the methodical attention of a man performing a sacred ritual. Cole was 34, from Flathead County, Montana, where his family had ranched cattle for 3 generations. He had joined the Navy at 19 because the ranch could not support another generation, and because he had discovered at age 12 that he could put a bullet through a playing card at 300 meters. The Navy had refined that talent into something extraordinary. Cole was one of the most accomplished snipers in SEAL team history, with confirmed engagements across 5 deployments that he never discussed. He was quiet in the way that deep water is quiet, still on the surface, immeasurable beneath. Cole was also the only person who knew about Reeves's headaches. 3 months ago, during a night watch, Reeves had suffered a severe episode, and Cole had found him gripping the edge of a HESCO barrier, face white and jaw clenched. Cole had told Reeves to report it. Reeves had refused. The knowledge sat between them like unexploded ordnance. Petty Officer First Class Andre Bishop, 29, was repacking his medical kit for the 3rd time, adding extra tourniquets and hemostatic gauze. Bishop was from Detroit, the son of a single mother who had worked 2 jobs to keep him off the streets. He had cross-trained into special operations medicine through the 18 Delta pipeline, becoming one of the most highly trained combat medics in the military. He was calm under pressure in a way that seemed constitutional, as though his nervous system had been designed for crisis. Bishop carried more medical supplies than any other team member because he had learned one lesson above all others. You never had enough until you had too much. Sergeant First Class Kyle Mercer, 31, sat on an ammunition crate sharpening his knife and telling a story about a bar fight in Pensacola that may or may not have been true. Mercer was originally a United States Marine, 2 tours in Iraq before passing selection for the SEALs. He was the team's demolitions expert, carrying C4 plastic explosive with the casual familiarity of a carpenter carrying a hammer. He was also the team's unofficial morale officer, dispensing dark humor in steady doses. From rural Alabama, he spoke with a drawl that thickened when amused and disappeared entirely when angry. Petty Officer Second Class Ryan Drake, 27, sat at the communications console running diagnostics on the SATCOM unit. Drake was the youngest member of the team and the newest on his first operational deployment. From Westerville, Ohio, the son of a high school English teacher named Margaret Drake, who had raised him alone after his father left when Ryan was 6. Drake was intelligent and technically gifted. He was also untested. Every other man on this team had been in combat. Drake had not. Reeves watched Drake work and felt the specific weight of responsibility that comes with leading someone into danger for the first time. For the deployment, Reeves had received a letter. Margaret Drake had written to the man responsible for her son's life. The letter was simple. It said that Ryan was all she had, that she trusted the men who would be beside him, and that she was asking, as one human being to another, for Reeves to bring her son home. Reeves carried the letter in his breast pocket every day since. It rested against his heart like a second dog tag. Petty Officer Second Class Tomas Vega, 30, leaned against the wall, studying intelligence photographs. Vega was from San Antonio, the son of Puerto Rican parents. He had grown up bilingual and added Pashto and Dari to his repertoire, becoming the team's primary interpreter and cultural liaison. His language skill was matched by an almost preternatural ability to read terrain, a talent he attributed to years of hunting feral hogs in the Texas Hill Country. Vega looked up from his photographs. Hawk, the imagery from yesterday's satellite pass shows fresh digging activity along the ridgeline above the valley floor. Someone has been moving dirt. Reeves examined the images. Disturbed earth was visible as lighter patches. It could be anything. Agricultural activity, animal burrows. Could be nothing, Reeves said. Could be, Vega agreed. But farmers don't usually dig on ridgelines with clear fields of fire. Reeves noted the observation. Intelligence had assessed the valley as low to moderate threat. The mission was reconnaissance only, simple. In Afghanistan, nothing was ever simple. 600 kilometers to the east, in a cave system above the valley, a man named Faisal Karimi unrolled a hand-drawn map on a flat stone and studied it by kerosene lantern. The map showed every contour, every boulder, every cave opening, every goat trail. It was more detailed than any satellite image because Karimi had walked every meter personally for 6 months. Karimi was approximately 55 years old. He had been fighting since he was 15, when Soviet helicopters turned his village into rubble. The Americans had found him in a refugee camp near Peshawar, Pakistan, in 1984. A thin, angry boy with steady hands. They had trained him, taught him to shoot, to plan ambushes, to coordinate attacks. They had taught him about American military tactics, about close air support procedures, about helicopter vulnerabilities in mountain terrain. They had given him weapons and skills. Then the Soviets left, and the Americans left, and Afghanistan descended into chaos. Karimi survived the Civil War, the Taliban, the American invasion. 2 sons killed, one by a Soviet mine in 1988, one by an American drone in 2009. His brother had died in 2015. Karimi did not fight for ideology. He fought because war was the only skill he possessed, and this valley was the only home he had left, and the Americans were in it. He had positioned over 80 fighters throughout the valley, AK-47 rifles, PKM machine guns, RPGs, 3 ZEU-23 anti-aircraft guns hidden in deep caves, 4 82mm mortar teams, and 2 SA-7 shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, his insurance against American helicopters. But his most dangerous weapon was knowledge. He knew how Americans fought because Americans had taught him. He knew SEAL teams would call for close air support. He knew the A-10 would come. He knew its attack patterns, and he had prepared countermeasures for each stage. He had also placed claymore mines along the ridgeline where any competent team would establish observation posts, positioned at exactly the locations that American tactical doctrine recommended, using their own training manual against them. Karimi stepped out of the cave into the mountain night. The stars above the Hindu Kush were brilliant and merciless. The same stars that had watched Alexander's armies march through these passes, that had watched the British Empire bleed and retreat. He looked down at the valley where his trap waited and spoke quietly to no one. Tomorrow, the SEAL team departed FOB Wolverine at 0130 hours, moving into the darkness on foot with the silent precision that defined their profession. Reeves led from the front, night vision goggles painting the world in shades of green. Behind him, the team moved in a staggered file, each man maintaining visual contact with the man ahead while covering a different sector. They moved for 6 hours through mountain terrain that would have been challenging in daylight and was punishing in darkness. Rocky slopes that crumbled underfoot, narrow ridgelines where a wrong step meant a 100-foot fall, dry creek beds choked with boulders. The team moved through all of it without speaking, communicating through hand signals and the intuitive understanding that came from months of operating together. Reeves set the pace steady and measured, aware that the 8-kilometer approach march would drain energy they might need later. Behind him, Cole moved with the fluid ease of a man born to mountain terrain, his Montana upbringing evident in every step. Mercer carried the heaviest load, his demolitions kit adding 20 pounds to the standard combat pack, but he moved without complaint and without slowing. Bishop stayed close to Drake, the medic's protective instinct drawn naturally toward the team's most inexperienced member. Drake himself moved well. His steps were careful but confident, the product of 18 months of SEAL training that had pushed him past every physical and mental limit he had believed he possessed. He had the SATCOM unit strapped to the top of his pack, its antenna folded flat against the frame, the weight of communications technology pressing between his shoulder blades like a reminder of his responsibility to the team. Vega walked point for the final 3 kilometers, his knowledge of the terrain and his ability to detect anomalies making him the natural choice for the approach to the target area. He moved with the economy of motion that marked a natural hunter, each footfall placed deliberately, his eyes scanning the ground and the horizon in a continuous sweep. At 0200, they crossed a ridgeline that gave them their first view of the valley system. Through the green tint of night vision, the canyon appeared as a dark wound in the earth, its walls rising like the sides of an ancient fortress. The valley floor was invisible in the shadows, but the canyon rims caught enough starlight to trace their jagged outlines against the sky. Reeves called a halt, and the team dropped to a knee, each man facing outward in a defensive perimeter, while their leader studied the terrain ahead. The air was thin at this altitude, cold enough that their breath formed small clouds even through the balaclavas they wore to reduce their thermal signatures. The silence was total. No wind, no insects, no distant sounds of habitation. Just 6 men breathing in the darkness on a mountainside halfway around the world from everyone they loved. Reeves checked his GPS coordinates against the mission plan and confirmed their position. They were on schedule. The observation post was 2 kilometers ahead, on the eastern ridge of the canyon, accessible by a goat trail that wound down from their current position through a series of switchbacks. They would reach the ridge by first light and establish their positions before the sun revealed them to anyone watching from below, if anyone was watching. Reeves looked at the valley and felt something he could not name, not fear. He had been afraid before, and this was different. It was closer to the feeling a man gets when he walks into a room and knows that something has changed since he was last there. Something out of place. Something wrong. But nothing he could point to and say that is the problem. Just a feeling. Operators learn to trust feelings. "Move out," he whispered, and the team resumed their approach. Elena reached her overwatch station at 0300, orbiting at 15,000 feet in the cold darkness above the mountains. Her sensors showed the SEAL team as a cluster of bright infrared dots moving through the landscape below, their body heat standing out against the cooling ground like embers on a dark hearth. She watched them approach the canyon with the protective attention of a hawk circling above its territory. "Bravo 6, Lightning 6 on station. I have eyes on you. Route ahead appears clear. No thermal signatures in the valley system." "Copy, Lightning 6. Good to have you upstairs." Reeves's voice was calm and professional, but Elena caught something in the transmission that made her lean forward slightly, a tightness that she recognized because she had heard it in her own voice before missions that went wrong. She noted it and continued her scan. The team reached the valley's eastern ridge as dawn began to lighten the sky from black to deep blue. The Hindu Kush materialized around them as the light grew, a landscape of savage beauty carved by millennia of wind and water and tectonic violence. The valley below was a deep gash in the earth, roughly 2 kilometers long and 200 meters wide at its narrowest point, with walls that rose 300 meters on each side like the ramparts of a fortress built by geology. A dry riverbed ran along the floor, flanked by scattered boulders and the occasional twisted tree that clung to the rocky soil with desperate tenacity. In the early morning light, the canyon looked ancient and empty, a wound in the earth that had been old when the first humans crossed these mountains. Vega was first to the ridgeline. He dropped to a prone position and scanned the valley through his binoculars, studying the terrain with the systematic attention of a man cataloging everything he saw against everything he expected to see. The intelligence briefing had described the valley as a suspected weapons transit corridor. What Vega saw troubled him, though he could not immediately articulate why. The valley was too quiet, no birds calling from the scattered trees, no animal movement in the dry creek bed, no wind stirring the vegetation on the canyon floor. It was the kind of silence that Vega associated with places where large predators had been active, places where every living thing that could hide was hiding. "It's too quiet," Vega murmured to Cole, who had set up beside him with his sniper rifle. Cole looked through his scope, sweeping the opposite canyon wall with slow, deliberate movements. "I don't see anything, but I smell it." Neither man could explain what they meant by that. It was not a literal smell. It was the accumulated intuition of decades of hunting and fighting, a sixth sense that had been sharpened by survival until it operated below the level of conscious thought. Something was wrong. They could feel it the way a sailor feels a storm before the clouds appear. Reeves arrived at this ridgeline and began positioning his team for observation. Standard procedure: Bishop and Mercer to the south, covering the lower valley approaches, Cole and Vega on the primary observation post, watching the suspected cache sites on the opposite wall. Drake set up the SATCOM and began establishing communication links with Phoebe, Wolverine, and Elena's at 10 overhead. Drake powered up the satellite communications unit and immediately frowned. He ran a diagnostic, checked the frequency settings, and frowned again. "Hawk, I'm picking up that encrypted burst again. Same frequency as the one I logged at the FOB. 3 seconds, then nothing. But this time I got a directional bearing." He paused, his young face tight with concentration. "It's coming from inside the valley, below us, 600 meters to the southeast." Reeves felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. An encrypted transmission originating from inside an uninhabited valley that intelligence had assessed as empty of human presence. It could be a coincidence. It could be an Afghan military unit or a border patrol element. It could be a malfunctioning piece of abandoned communications equipment. Or it could be a spotter, someone inside the valley, hidden and waiting, communicating the SEAL team's exact position to someone else. "Elena, can you scan the valley floor southeast of our position? About 600 meters. Drake is picking up an encrypted signal from that area." Elena adjusted her sensor pod and swept the indicated area. Infrared showed nothing unusual. The rocks were uniformly cool in the early morning air. If someone was down there, they were hidden well enough to mask their heat signature, which meant caves or prepared positions with overhead cover. "Bravo 6, I'm not picking up any thermal signatures in that area. Could be underground or in a cave system. I'll keep watching." Reeves looked at the valley below him. He looked at his team, positioned along the ridge exactly where the textbooks said they should be. Observation posts at the points with the best fields of view, the positions that maximized surveillance coverage, the positions that standard operating procedures for reconnaissance operations recommended. He looked at the disturbed Earth that Vega had noticed in the satellite photographs. He thought about the encrypted burst originating from a valley that was supposed to be empty. And then he thought about something Vega had said during the briefing, a sentence that had seemed like idle observation at the time, but now felt like a warning he should have heeded. Farmers don't usually dig on ridgelines with clear fields of fire. The realization hit him like a cold wave crashing over the bow of a ship. The digging, the ridgeline, the positions with the best fields of fire. Someone had been preparing this ground, not for farming, not for construction, for war. And they had prepared it in exactly the places where American-trained operators would choose to set up, because whoever had planned this understood American doctrine well enough to predict where the SEALs would be standing. Reeves opened his mouth to order his team off the ridge. He was too late by 1.5 seconds. The Claymore detonated 6 meters above Cole and Vega's position, mounted in a rock crevice where it had been placed weeks ago and aimed downward along the ridgeline with lethal precision. 700 steel ball bearings traveling at 1,200 meters per second raked across the ridge in a horizontal fan of destruction that no amount of body armor could withstand at that range. The blast threw Cole sideways into a rock outcropping with enough force to crack the stock of his sniper rifle. Vega was slammed flat against the ground, his ears ringing and his vision white from the concussive overpressure. Drake, 15 meters down the ridge near the SATCOM, was hurled backward off his equipment, the satellite antenna shattered by ball bearings, the primary communications array destroyed in a single violent instant. A gash opened on his forehead, and his left leg twisted beneath him as he fell. A piece of shrapnel caught Bishop in the left shoulder, tearing through his tactical vest and embedding itself in the muscle and tendon beneath, with a pain that made the experienced medic cry out for the first time in his career. Mercer, positioned furthest south, was outside the Claymore's primary kill radius. He hit the ground on instinct, weapon up, scanning for the threat before the echo of the explosion had faded. And then the valley erupted. Gunfire from 3 directions simultaneously. The northern wall, the southern wall, the canyon floor, 80 fighters opening up at once with AK-47s and PKM machine guns, the sound of their weapons merging into a continuous roar that bounced off the canyon walls and filled the valley with a noise that sounded like the earth itself was screaming. Muzzle flashes winked from dozens of positions. Small bursts of fire that appeared and disappeared among the rocks like malevolent stars being born and dying in the space of a heartbeat. The ridge became untenable in seconds. Rounds cracked and sparked off the rocks from below, from across the canyon, from positions that seemed to be everywhere at once. The team was driven off the ridge by the sheer volume of fire, tumbling and sliding down the slope toward the canyon floor. Exactly where Karimi wanted them. Exactly where 80 fighters had overlapping fields of fire, and the Americans had no cover worth the name. Reeves hit the valley floor hard, rolled behind a boulder, and assessed with the speed that 18 years of training had made automatic. His team was scattered across 40 meters of rocky ground at the base of the eastern wall. Bishop was bleeding from his shoulder but moving. Drake was dazed, blood running from his forehead, left leg injured. Cole and Vega were shaken from the claymore but functional. Mercer had found cover and was returning fire. The SATCOM was destroyed. Their primary link to the outside world was gone. But Reeves had the backup radio, shorter range, weaker signal, but it worked. He keyed the handset and spoke the words that would bring Elena Graves diving out of the sky toward the worst day of both their lives. Lightning 6, this is Bravo 6. Troops in contact. We are in the kill box. I say again, we are in the kill box. 15,000 feet above, Elena heard the transmission and felt the blood drain from her face. She looked down at the valley and saw what Reeves could not see from the ground. Muzzle flashes, dozens of them, flickering along both canyon walls and across the floor in a pattern that spoke of careful preparation and murderous intent. This was not a chance encounter. This was not an opportunistic ambush. This was a trap designed by someone who understood American tactics and had built a killing field calibrated to exploit every advantage the terrain could offer. She thought of Korengal, 3 names in a notebook, 2 minutes too late. Not this time, not ever again. Elena pushed her throttle forward, and the A-10 rolled into a dive, its nose dropping toward the Valley of Shadows, the massive GAU-8 cannon pointing like a finger of judgment toward the enemy below. Bravo 6, Lightning 6, I'm coming. The world became sound before anything else. That was what combat did. It stripped away every sense except the one you could not shut off. The crack of AK rounds splitting the air at supersonic speed. The deeper thud of heavy machine gun fire echoing off canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And underneath all of it, the primal screaming of men trying to kill each other in a place that God had forgotten. Lieutenant Commander Daniel Reeves pressed his face into the rocky ground and tasted blood. His ears rang from the claymore blast that had thrown his team off the ridge and down into the canyon floor, exactly where Faisal Karimi had wanted them. The ringing was sharp and high, a note that seemed to drill directly through his skull and settle behind his eyes where the old pain lived. The TBI pain, the one he had told no one about except Nathan Cole, and even Cole did not know how bad it truly was. Reeves forced his eyes open and assessed the situation with the cold precision that 18 years of service had hammered into his nervous system. They were pinned against the eastern wall of the canyon, spread across roughly 40 meters of rocky ground with minimal cover. The enemy had positioned fighters at multiple elevations on both canyon walls, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned the entire floor into a killing zone. Every direction was death. He turned his head and saw Andre Bishop 7 meters to his left, wedged behind a rock barely large enough to cover his torso. The medic's left shoulder was soaked dark with blood where shrapnel from the claymore had torn through his tactical vest. But Bishop was moving. His right hand held his M4 carbine, finger on the trigger guard, discipline intact even with a wound that would have put most men flat on their backs. Bishop caught Reeves's eye and gave a single nod, still in the fight. 15 meters beyond Bishop, Kyle Mercer had found a shallow depression in the canyon floor and was using it like a foxhole, firing controlled bursts at muzzle flashes on the northern wall. Between bursts, Mercer was talking. He was always talking. "Well, this is just about the worst morning I've had since my ex-wife's lawyer called," Mercer said to no one in particular, squeezing off another 3-round burst. At least her lawyer didn't have a heavy machine gun. The humor was Mercer's way of telling the team he was functional and alert. Dark humor was oxygen for men in desperate situations. Nathan Cole had wedged himself into a narrow crevice where 2 boulders met the canyon wall. Through the scope of his MK-13 sniper rifle, Cole was doing what he did better than almost anyone alive. Each shot was a deliberate act of violence, calm and precise. Identify a muzzle flash. Calculate range and wind in the space between heartbeats. Exhale. Squeeze. The rifle would bark once and a distant figure would crumple. He had killed 4 men in the first 90 seconds, but there were over 70 remaining, and each time he fired, a storm of bullets would hammer the rocks around his position. He was winning individual duels, but the mathematics were impossible. He could not kill them fast enough. Tomas Vega had taken the position 10 meters behind the main group, covering their rear. His dark eyes moved constantly, scanning the terrain with the instinct of a man who had grown up hunting feral hogs in the Texas Hill Country. That skill translated perfectly to combat. He could detect movement that other men would miss entirely. "Hawk, I've got movement to our east," Vega called out. "They're trying to work around behind us. At least 6, maybe 8 fighters." Reeves processed this information and felt the tactical picture darken further. They were being surrounded. Karimi was not simply trying to pin them down. He was systematically closing every avenue of escape, tightening the noose with the patience of a man who had been fighting wars since before most of this SEAL team was born. And then there was Ryan Drake. The youngest member of the team lay where the Claymore blast had thrown him, partially concealed behind a scatter of rocks near the destroyed SATCOM equipment. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead, and his left leg was injured, though how badly Reeves could not yet determine. Drake was conscious, his eyes wide with the particular expression that Reeves had seen on the faces of men experiencing their first real combat. It was not exactly fear. It was the sudden, violent collision between everything training had promised and everything reality actually delivered. Training told you that combat would be intense. Reality showed you that intense was a word people used when they had never felt the air crack apart an inch from their skull. But Drake was not frozen. His hands were moving across the remains of the SATCOM unit, fingers probing the shattered casing with the focused determination of a man who understood that the piece of equipment in his hands might be the difference between rescue and annihilation. The primary satellite communications array was destroyed. The Claymore had seen to that with brutal efficiency. But Drake was already pulling components from the wreckage, his mind racing through the technical possibilities, even as bullets stitched patterns in the dirt around him. Reeves keyed his radio, the backup unit, shorter range, less reliable, but it was what they had. "Lightning 6, this is Bravo 6. Troops in contact. I say again, troops in contact. We are pinned in the canyon floor with fire from all directions. 2 wounded. Request immediate close air support on enemy positions, both canyon walls." The response came through static and interference, the canyon walls playing havoc with radio signals. But Captain Elena Graves' voice cut through the noise with a clarity that felt almost physical. "Bravo 6, Lightning 6. I have visual on your position. I count enemy firing positions on both canyon walls at multiple elevations. I'm coming in on the north wall first. Mark your position with smoke and get everyone as low as possible. This is going to be danger close." Reeves pulled a smoke grenade from his vest and yanked the pin. The canister hissed as it began pouring green smoke into the morning air, a signal that would tell the pilot above exactly where the friendlies ended and the killing could begin. He threw it toward the center of their position and watched the emerald cloud billow upward against the brown canyon walls. "Smoke out. Green smoke marks friendly position." "Copy green smoke. I'm in hot. 30 seconds. Reeves turned to his team, and his voice carried the command authority that comes not from rank, but from absolute trust earned over years in blood. "Air support inbound. Get down and stay down. This is going to be close." Every SEAL pressed himself into the earth as though trying to merge with the rock itself. Bishop pulled a flat stone over his wounded shoulder. Mercer rolled deeper into his depression. Cole curled into his crevice. Vega went prone behind the largest boulder he could find. Drake wrapped his arms over his head and pushed his face into the gravel. And then the sound came. If you have never heard a GAU-8 Avenger cannon firing, there is no combination of words in the English language that can truly prepare you for it. The weapon does not sound like a gun. It sounds like the fabric of the air itself being ripped apart by something massive and angry. The characteristic sound that pilots called the Burt was less a noise than a physical event, a vibration that entered through the chest and resonated in the bones. The cannon fired 70 rounds per second, each one a 30-millimeter projectile of depleted uranium capable of penetrating the armor of a main battle tank. When those rounds struck the sandstone and granite of the canyon wall, the effect was apocalyptic. The northern wall erupted in a chain of explosions that sent massive clouds of dust and rock fragments cascading down into the canyon. Enemy firing positions that had been carved into the stone over weeks of preparation were pulverized in seconds. Taliban fighters who had felt invincible behind their rock fortifications found those fortifications disintegrating around them. Bodies fell from ledges, weapons tumbled through the air. The disciplined fire that had pinned the SEALs down faltered and then ceased entirely from the northern side, as survivors dove for deeper cover or simply ceased to exist. "Good hits! Good hits is on the north wall!" Reeves shouted into his radio, his voice raw with relief and adrenaline. "Northern positions suppressed, but we're still taking heavy fire from the south and we have fighters closing from the east." High above, Elena pulled her A-10 out of its attack dive and felt the aircraft shudder as she climbed. She was already calculating her next approach, running the geometry of the canyon through her mind with the speed that comes from 3 years of flying combat missions in these mountains. The southern wall would be harder. The enemy positions were closer to the SEAL's location, which meant her margin for error was even smaller. 1 degree off in her approach angle, 1 second late on the trigger, and her own cannon would kill the men she was trying to save. But there was something else nagging at her, a tactical instinct that had been sharpened by hundreds of hours of studying enemy tactics and intelligence briefings. The enemy had not reacted to her first pass with surprise. There had been no panic in their fire patterns, no desperate scattering. The fighters on the southern wall had actually intensified their attack on the SEALs during her strafing run, as though they had been waiting for exactly this moment. Someone down there was thinking ahead of her, someone who understood how American close air support worked and had planned for it. On the northern wall of the canyon, in a command position reinforced with timber and stone, Faisal Karimi watched the dust settle from the A-10's first attack with an expression that held neither surprise nor despair. He had expected this. He had planned for this. The positions on the northern wall were his first layer, sacrificial pieces arranged on the board to absorb the opening move of the American air response. Those fighters had served their purpose. They had pinned the SEALs in the kill zone long enough for the main trap to close. And now they had absorbed the first attack run, giving Karimi time to prepare his true countermeasures. He keyed his radio and spoke in Pashto, his voice calm and measured. "All southern positions hold fire until the aircraft commits to its second run. Anti-aircraft teams, prepare to engage. Wait for my command. Do not fire until the aircraft is inside the canyon. We need it close." The 3 Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns were hidden deep in caves along the canyon walls. Their twin 23mm barrels pointed at the sky through narrow openings that were nearly invisible from the air. Soviet-manufactured weapons from another era of Afghan warfare, they were still devastatingly effective against low-flying aircraft. Karimi had positioned them based on his understanding of A-10 attack patterns, knowledge that the CIA had given him 30 years ago when America and the Mujahideen had fought on the same side against the same enemy. He remembered the American instructors at the training camps in Pakistan, young men with confident smiles who had taught him about air support coordination, about the angles of attack that ground support aircraft used, about the minimum distances for danger-close engagements. They had taught him how to call in airstrikes. Now he used that knowledge to defend against them. The Americans always came back for a second pass from a different angle. That was doctrine. That was what the manuals said. And that was what Karimi was counting on. Elena rolled her A-10 into the approach for her second run, coming in from the southeast this time to avoid presenting the same profile to any remaining threats. The southern canyon wall filled her targeting display, muzzle flashes still winking from concealed positions where fighters continued to pour fire down on the trapped Americans. She could see the green smoke drifting across the canyon floor, marking where 6 men were fighting for their lives against impossible odds. "Bravo 6, Lightning 6, coming in on the south wall. Keep your heads down." She pushed the nose over and dove into the canyon. The Zu-23s opened fire at the exact moment Karimi commanded. The sound was different from small arms fire. Heavier, deeper, a rhythmic hammering that Elena felt through her entire airframe before her mind even registered the orange tracers streaking past her cockpit. 23mm rounds, each one nearly an inch in diameter, began impacting her aircraft with the force of sledgehammer blows against sheet metal. Warning lights erupted across her instrument panel in a cascade of amber and red. The left wing took multiple hits, and Elena watched through her peripheral vision as hydraulic fluid began streaming from ruptured lines, painting red streaks across the gray metal surface. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was built to absorb punishment that would destroy any other aircraft in the American inventory. Its titanium cockpit could withstand 23mm rounds. Its redundant flight controls allowed operation even with catastrophic damage. Every design choice reflected a single philosophy. This machine will keep flying long after any reasonable expectation of survival has been exceeded. But the A-10's designers had never envisioned a pilot flying into the coordinated fire of 3 anti-aircraft guns positioned by a commander who knew exactly how the aircraft would approach. Elena gritted her teeth and held her dive. The targeting reticle settled on the enemy positions along the southern wall, and she pressed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared again, sending its stream of devastation into the rock face. Enemy positions exploded. Fighters were thrown from their hiding places. But even as she destroyed the southern threats, the anti-aircraft fire continued to hammer her aircraft from positions she could not yet see. Her left engine temperature spiked into the red. A master caution alarm blared in her headset. Hydraulic pressure on the primary system was dropping fast. Taking fire, she transmitted, her voice controlled despite the violence being inflicted on her aircraft. Multiple anti-aircraft positions. I'm hit but still flying. She pulled out of this canyon and climbed, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly to her control inputs. The left engine was running rough now, its turbine damaged by fragments that had penetrated the nacelle. She was losing systems one by one, like lights going out in a building during a power failure. But the cannon still worked. The wings still held. The remaining engine still produced thrust. She was still in the fight. On the ground, the effect of Elena's second pass was immediate but incomplete. The southern wall fell partially silent as destroyed positions stopped firing. But enough fighters survived in deeper caves and crevices to maintain pressure on the seals. And now the fighters closing from the east that Vega had spotted were getting closer. Reeves counted muzzle flashes and felt the mathematics of combat working against him. They had survived the initial ambush and 2 attack runs from their air support, but the enemy still had overwhelming numbers. The canyon was too large and too complex for a single aircraft to clear, especially one that was now visibly damaged. Then the mortars began. The first round announced itself with the distinctive whistle that every combat veteran recognizes instantly. The 82mm round impacted 30 meters from their position, sending a geyser of rock and dust 50 feet into the air. "Incoming! Mortars!" Reeves screamed. The second round landed closer, 20 meters. Fragments whipped past his helmet. The enemy had a forward observer, walking the fire toward them with methodical precision. "They're adjusting. Next one's going to be right on top of us," Cole said, his voice carrying the flat calm of a man who had accepted all possible outcomes. Bishop was trying to treat his own wound while pressed flat against the ground. The medic had torn open a pressure bandage with his teeth and was attempting to pack the shrapnel wound in his shoulder with one hand, while the earth trembled around him from mortar impacts. His face was pale, too pale, the color draining as blood continued to seep through the initial field dressing. He needed real treatment. He needed an operating room and a surgeon and a blood transfusion. What he had was a roll of gauze and 30 seconds between explosions. A third mortar round impacted, and this one was close enough to shower the entire team with rock fragments. Mercer grunted as a piece of stone the size of a golf ball struck his helmet, and Drake cried out as debris pelted his back and legs. The forward observer had their range now. The next round would be a direct hit. Reeves keyed his radio to Elena. "Lightning 6, we are taking accurate mortar fire. They have our range. We need those mortar positions eliminated or we are finished." Elena was already scanning the canyon through her damaged targeting pod, searching for the telltale puff of smoke that would reveal a mortar position at the moment of firing. The pod's optics were degraded from the damage to her aircraft, but she could still make out details on the canyon floor. She watched, waited, and there, a flash of smoke from behind a cluster of boulders 200 meters northwest of the SEAL position. The mortar tube was hidden from ground view, but briefly visible from above at the moment of firing. "Bravo 6, I have a mortar position identified, 200 meters northwest of your smoke, but I've taken significant damage, and I'm not sure how many more passes I can make." The truth was worse than she let on. Her left engine was producing barely 30% power. Hydraulic pressure was critical. The flight controls felt like she was trying to steer a truck with a broken power steering pump. Every input required physical force that was already draining her stamina. She was flying a dying aircraft over a canyon full of men who wanted to kill her. And the only thing keeping her in the sky was the extraordinary engineering of an airplane designed 40 years ago to survive exactly this kind of punishment. But the mortar had to be stopped. It was at this moment that the thing Reeves had feared most for 8 months finally happened. The pain had been building since the Claymore explosion. The blast over pressure, the impact with the ground, the sustained stress of combat, all of it feeding the damaged neural pathways in his brain like fuel on smoldering coals. He had been managing it, forcing it down with willpower and experience, compartmentalizing the way he had been trained to compartmentalize every distraction on a mission. But the human brain is not a machine, and traumatic brain injury does not care about willpower or training or the lives that depend on you. The migraine hit like a white-hot spike driven through his left temple. Reeves's vision blurred. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, as though someone had smeared Vaseline across his eyes. The canyon, the rocks, the muzzle flashes, all of it dissolved into a nauseating swirl of color and shadow. His balance failed and he sagged against the boulder he had been using for cover, his weapon dropping from suddenly nerveless fingers. The sound of combat faded to a distant roaring, like listening to a battle through a wall of water. He tried to speak, and what came out was not words but a groan that he could not control. He was on his knees, then on his side, his body convulsing in a dry heave that left him gasping and shaking on the ground while 80 fighters tried to kill his team 20 meters away. "Hawk is down!" Cole's voice cut through the chaos. The sniper had been watching Reeves from his position, had seen the team leader collapse, and had recognized immediately what was happening. He had known about the TBI. He had been the one Reeves confided in during a quiet moment at the FOB 3 months ago, after a migraine episode that Reeves had barely hidden from the rest of the team. Cole had urged him to report it. Reeves had refused. And now the bill was coming due at the worst possible moment. "I have command," Cole announced on the team frequency. The protocol was correct. When a team leader went down, the next senior operator assumed command. But Nathan Cole was a sniper, not a tactical commander. Behind a rifle, he operated with mechanical perfection. But coordinating a 6-man team in a complex firefight required holding the entire tactical picture in your mind simultaneously, making split-second decisions about priorities and resource allocation while bullets cracked past your ears. The next 90 seconds were the most dangerous of the entire battle. Cole directed Mercer to cover the eastern approaches, but failed to account for the shifting threat from the west. He pulled Vega off rear security, leaving their 6 o'clock completely uncovered. 3 Taliban fighters began crawling through the rocks toward Drake's position. Drake saw them first. The 27-year-old from Ohio on his first combat deployment looked up from the SATCOM unit and saw 3 men with AK-47 rifles moving through the rocks toward him. They were close enough that he could see their faces, close enough that there was no time to call for help. Drake dropped the circuit board, grabbed his M4, and engaged all 3 fighters in a burst that lasted less than 2 seconds. 2 went down immediately. The third dove behind a rock and Drake tracked him, waiting with his weapon shouldered until the man's head appeared. 1 shot. The fighter slumped and was still. Drake's hands were shaking. He had just killed 3 human beings at a range close enough to see the color of their eyes. But he did not freeze. Something shifted inside him, some boundary between the person he had been and the person he was becoming. And when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that surprised everyone on the frequency. "Cole, we've got nothing covering the west side. Mercer needs to shift left. Vega, get back on rear security. They're going to try flanking us again." There was a moment of silence on the radio. 1 second, 2. Cole was a proud man, a 15-year veteran who did not take direction easily, especially not from a 27-year-old on his first deployment. But Cole was also a professional who recognized the tactical reality of what Drake had just said and what Drake had just done. "Copy that," Cole replied. "Mercer, shift to western coverage. Vega, you've got our 6. Drake, good kill. Keep those eyes open." The team's defensive perimeter reformed. The gap closed. The western approach that had nearly allowed fighters to penetrate their position was now covered. And Ryan Drake, who had woken up that morning as the newest and least experienced member of the team, had just made his first command decision under fire. Reeves came back. It took 3 minutes of lying on the ground with the worst pain he had ever experienced while his team fought around him. 3 minutes during which he was completely helpless. The shame of that would stay with him longer than any physical wound. But the pain receded enough for his vision to clear. He heard Drake's voice on the radio coordinating the defense, and for a moment Reeves simply listened. The kid was doing it right, not perfectly, but with an instinctive understanding of tactical priorities that could not be taught. Reeves pushed himself to his feet, retrieved his weapon, and scanned the situation. The team was holding with the arrangement Drake had organized. "This is Bravo 6. I'm back up. Good work, Drake. I have command." He paused. "Now get that goddamn radio working to base." Drake looked at Reeves across 10 meters of rocky ground, and something passed between them that neither would ever fully articulate. Reeves saw in Drake's eyes the end of innocence, and Drake saw in Reeves's eyes something unexpected. Gratitude. Elena was already scanning the canyon through her damaged targeting pod, searching for the telltale puff of smoke from a mortar position. The pod's optics were degraded, but she could still make out details. She watched, waited. There, a flash of smoke from behind a boulder cluster 200 meters northwest. "Bravo 6, I have a mortar position, 200 meters northwest of your smoke, but I'm not sure how many more passes this aircraft can make." The truth was worse than she let on. Her left engine was at 30%, hydraulic pressure critical. Every control input required physical force that was draining her stamina. She was flying a dying aircraft over a canyon full of men who wanted to kill her. Reeves coordinated the team. On his signal, every SEAL who could fire a weapon would direct their fire at the cave openings where the Zu-23 guns had been firing from. They could not destroy the anti-aircraft guns with rifle fire, but they could force the gunners to take cover long enough for Elena to make her pass. Stand by, now." 5 M4 carbines opened up simultaneously, pouring fire at the anti-aircraft positions on the canyon walls. The concentrated barrage of 5.56 millimeter rounds was not powerful enough to penetrate the stone that protected the Zu-23 crews. But the impact sent stone chips and dust spraying into the cave openings, forcing the gunners to duck away from their weapons. Elena dove into the canyon. Her damaged aircraft groaned in protest as she pushed it into the attack angle. The flight controls resisted her inputs, the hydraulic system fighting to maintain pressure as fluid continued to leak from a dozen punctures. Her left engine was barely producing enough power to maintain airspeed, and the entire airframe vibrated with a deep, unhealthy frequency that told her structural integrity was being compromised. She lined up on the mortar position. The targeting reticle settled on the cluster of boulders. Her finger found the trigger. The GAU-8 fired. The boulders exploded. The mortar tube, the ammunition, the crew, all of it was consumed in a hurricane of depleted uranium rounds that chewed through stone and steel and flesh with equal indifference. Secondary explosions erupted as stored mortar rounds detonated, sending a pillar of smoke and debris climbing into the morning sky. But the suppressive fire from the SEALs lasted exactly as long as Reeves had promised, and not 1 second longer. As the SEAL rifles fell silent, the Zu-23 crews returned to their guns and opened fire on Elena's retreating aircraft. More hits, more damage, more warning lights joining the constellation of failures already illuminating her cockpit. Her left engine died completely. The turbine seized with a grinding shriek that Elena felt through her seat, and then silence from the left side of her aircraft. She was flying on one engine now, with degraded hydraulics, structural damage, and a targeting system that flickered in and out of functionality. "Bravo 6, Lightning 6, mortar position destroyed, but I've lost my left engine. I'm on one engine with critical damage across multiple systems." She paused. The next words were the hardest she had ever spoken. "I can stay on station, but my offensive capability is severely limited. I've still got cannon rounds, but I don't know how many more passes this aircraft can take." On the ground, Reeves absorbed this information and felt the tactical situation closing in around him like the walls of the canyon itself. Their air support was crippled. Their ammunition was dwindling. They had one seriously wounded man and no way to communicate with their base for reinforcements. The enemy still had them surrounded with superior numbers, and somewhere out there, more mortar positions were preparing to fire. Reeves checked his watch. They had been in contact for 27 minutes. It felt like hours. It felt like days. Time in combat had its own physics, stretching and compressing in ways that defied measurement. But the clock was running on more than just the battle. He had noticed the sky changing when he regained his feet after the TBI episode. The clear morning blue was giving way to a gray haze creeping in from the north, cloud cover. And behind those clouds, something worse. The weather briefing at FOB Wolverine had mentioned the possibility of an early season storm system moving down from the Hindu Kush. Snow, high winds, zero visibility. If that storm reached the canyon before they were extracted, no helicopter could fly in to get them. They would be trapped in the canyon overnight with wounded men, no ammunition, and an enemy that knew exactly where they were. Drake had been working on the SATCOM with the focus and intensity of a man disarming a bomb. His fingers moved across the circuit boards and connectors with the technical precision that had made him the top communications specialist in his Bud/S class. The primary array was destroyed beyond repair, but the secondary radio unit had survived the Claymore blast with damage that was severe but potentially fixable. The satellite uplink module was cracked, but the internal components appeared intact. The power supply was functional. What he needed was a connection between the radio's transmitter and the satellite module's antenna, a connection that the Claymore had severed. Drake stripped a wire from the destroyed primary unit, spliced it with steady hands despite the explosions and gunfire around him, and made the connection. The secondary radio crackled. Static. Then faintly the hiss of an open satellite channel. Wolverine Base, this is Bravo 6 Romeo on emergency SATCOM, how copy? The response came through layers of static and interference, but it was there. A human voice. A connection to the world beyond this canyon of death. Bravo 6 Romeo, this is Wolverine Base. We read you weak but clear. Send your traffic. Drake looked at Reeves. Reeves gave him a nod. Drake transmitted. Wolverine Base, Bravo 6 Romeo. Troops in contact, Grid Square 41 Sierra Quebec, Delta 123 45678. 6 personnel, 2 wounded, 1 urgent surgical. We are pinned by estimated 60+ enemy fighters with heavy weapons, including anti-aircraft and mortars. Our air support is critically damaged. Request immediate MEDEVAC in QRF. I say again, request immediate MEDEVAC in QRF. How copy? The pause that followed lasted 4 seconds. It felt like 4 years. Bravo 6 Romeo, Wolverine Base copies all. Be advised, Dust Off 72 and Apache Flight are being scrambled. QRF Ranger element is mounting up. Earliest ETA to your position is 35 minutes. Can you hold? 35 minutes. Reeves looked at his wounded medic, whose face was now the color of old paper. He looked at his team's ammunition, measured now in individual rounds rather than magazines. He looked at the sky, where gray clouds were eating the blue with the steady appetite of an approaching storm. He looked at the canyon walls, where enemy fighters were already repositioning for another assault. And he did the math that every combat leader eventually has to do. The math of lives and time and probability. The math that never balances. Wolverine Base, Bravo 6, will hold. Because there was no other answer. Because you did not tell your base that you could not hold. Because holding was not a choice or a decision or a tactical calculation. It was simply what you did when the alternative was dying. And dying was not acceptable when you had promised a woman in Ohio that you would bring her son home. Elena heard the exchange from above and made her own calculation. 35 minutes. Her fuel gauge showed 22 minutes of flying time remaining on one engine. Her aircraft was held together by titanium, redundancy, and the stubborn refusal of American engineering to accept defeat. She had enough cannon ammunition for perhaps 2 more effective passes, if the aircraft survived the anti-aircraft fire long enough to use them. 22 minutes of fuel, 35 minutes until rescue arrived. The math did not work, but Elena Graves had never been good at accepting mathematics that told her people had to die. Bravo 6, Lightning 6. I'm staying on station until relief arrives. We'll figure out the fuel situation when we get there. It was a lie. She knew exactly what the fuel situation meant. But it was the kind of lie that warriors tell each other when the truth is too heavy to carry alongside everything else. Below her, the canyon waited. The enemy was regrouping. The storm was coming. And the longest hour of all their lives was about to begin. Mercer looked up at the thin trail of black smoke that marked Elena's damaged A-10 against the graying sky and shook his head slowly. He checked his remaining magazines, redistributed rounds between 3 of them so that each had an equal count. Then he seated a fresh magazine in his M4, charged the weapon, and settled back into his fighting position. 35 minutes, he said to no one in particular. I once waited 40 minutes for a table at Waffle House in Mobile after an Alabama game. This ain't even the worst wait I've had. Cole loaded one of his last sniper rounds, pressed his eye to the scope, and began scanning for targets. Vega covered the rear, his dark eyes missing nothing. Drake returned to the SATCOM, monitoring the connection, ready to relay any update. Bishop, pale and bleeding but conscious, propped his M4 against the rock with his good hand and pointed it toward the enemy. And Reeves stood at the center of his team, the pain still pulsing behind his eyes like a second heartbeat. The letter from Drake's mother pressed against his chest, and watched the storm clouds gather over the mountains that had been killing soldiers since before Alexander the Great marched through these same valleys 23 centuries ago. They would hold, not because they were heroes, not because they were the most elite warriors America could produce, though they were, not because they had superior training or superior technology or superior willpower, though they had all of those things. They would hold because the alternative was unthinkable, because every man in that canyon had someone waiting for them at home. Because the brotherhood of men who fight together is not a slogan or a bumper sticker or a line in a recruitment commercial. It is a covenant written in blood and kept in the only currency that matters. They would hold because that is what warriors do when there is no other choice. They stand in the worst place on earth and they refuse to fall. The canyon waited, the storm gathered, and the killing was far from over. The killing was not over. It had barely begun. 12 minutes had passed since Drake's emergency transmission reached Phoebe B. Wolverine. 12 minutes since the promise of rescue had entered the canyon like a thin thread of hope stretched across an ocean of violence. 35 minutes, they had been told. 35 minutes until Dust-Off 72 and the Apache gunships could reach them. 23 minutes remained. But time in the canyon of death moved according to its own brutal arithmetic, and every second that ticked past carried with it the possibility that one more American would stop breathing on this foreign ground. The enemy had not waited. Faisal Karimi stood in his reinforced command position on the upper reaches of the northern canyon wall, surveying the battlefield through a pair of battered Soviet binoculars that he had carried since 1986. The American pilot's attacks had cost him dearly. 23 of his fighters were confirmed dead. Another 8 were wounded badly enough to be combat ineffective. His primary mortar position was destroyed, and several of his best firing positions along both canyon walls had been reduced to smoking rubble by the devastating 30mm cannon. But Karimi had built his ambush with depth, and depth was the one advantage that patience always provided. He still had over 40 fighters positioned throughout the canyon system. 3 mortar teams remained operational, repositioning now to new firing coordinates. His 3 Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns had survived the American air attacks because he had ordered them to fire only in short bursts and then relocate, a tactic he had learned from Chechen veterans who had fought the Russians in Grozny. And most importantly, he still had his final weapon, the 2 SA-7 shoulder-fired missiles hidden in a cave near the canyon's western mouth, weapons he was saving for the moment that would matter most. Karimi understood the American way of war with the intimacy of a man who had once been its student. He knew that the SEAL team had called for rescue. He knew that helicopters would come. And he knew that the narrow canyon, with its towering walls and unpredictable winds, would force those helicopters to approach along predictable flight paths. The missiles were positioned to exploit exactly that vulnerability. But first, he needed to ensure the Americans could not escape before the helicopters arrived. If the SEALs managed to move out of the canyon on foot, his entire plan would unravel. He needed them pinned in place, bleeding, desperate, calling for extraction so loudly that the rescue helicopters would rush in without the caution that might save them. He keyed his radio and issued orders in rapid Pashto. The remaining mortar teams would resume fire immediately, not to kill the Americans, though that would be welcome, but to keep them immobilized. His ground fighters would tighten the perimeter from 3 sides, pushing closer under cover of the mortar barrage. And a special team of 12 of his best men, veterans who had survived a decade of fighting, would move through a hidden goat trail along the eastern canyon wall to establish a blocking position behind the Americans, sealing off the last possible escape route. The trap was closing for the second time, and this time Karimi intended to catch everything inside it. On the canyon floor, the brief respite that Elena's mortar strike had provided was already evaporating. Andre Bishop lay against a blood-smeared rock, his face the color of old parchment, his breathing shallow and rapid. The pressure bandage on his shoulder was soaked through, dark red turning to nearly black at the edges, where the blood was beginning to coagulate. His left arm was useless, the shrapnel having severed tendons that connected his shoulder to his bicep. He could feel his heartbeat in the wound, each pulse sending a fresh wave of pain that he had stopped trying to manage and simply endured. But Bishop was a combat medic, and even in his diminished state, his training would not let him rest. He was watching Tomas Vega. Vega had been hit during the mortar barrage, not directly but close enough. A round had impacted 4 meters from his position, and the blast wave had driven rock fragments into his chest like a shotgun blast of stone. 2 fragments had penetrated his body armor at the seam between the front and side plates, an area that offered minimal protection against high-velocity debris. Vega had felt the impacts as 2 sharp punches below his right armpit, and for a moment he thought the damage was minor. Then he tried to take a deep breath, and the air would not come. He coughed, and what came out was pink, frothy, the color of aerated blood. "Bishop." Vega's voice was a whisper, thin and wet, sounding in a way that made the medic's stomach drop. "I think I've got a problem." Bishop dragged himself across 4 meters of open ground to reach Vega, bullets cracking overhead as he moved with the desperate urgency of a man who understood exactly what pink froth meant. Pneumothorax. One or both of the rock fragments had punctured Vega's chest wall and possibly his lung. Air was leaking into the pleural space, the area between the lung and the chest wall, and with each breath, the pressure was increasing. If left untreated, the lung would collapse completely. If both lungs were affected, Vega would suffocate. Bishop worked with one hand, his left arm hung useless at his side, the shoulder wound making any movement of that limb an exercise in pure agony. He tore open Vega's body armor with his teeth in his right hand, exposing the chest wounds. 2 holes, each about the size of a pencil eraser, bubbling slightly with each breath. The sucking sound was faint but unmistakable. He needed to perform a needle decompression. Insert a 14-gauge needle into the chest cavity to release the trapped air and prevent the lung from collapsing further. It was a procedure he had practiced hundreds of times on mannequins and simulation dummies during training. He had never performed it on a living teammate under fire with one functional hand. "Vega, this is going to hurt. Don't move." Bishop pulled the decompression needle from his medical kit, located the second intercostal space on Vega's right side, mid-clavicular line, and drove the needle through the chest wall with a firm, practiced thrust. There was a hiss of escaping air as the trapped pressure released, and Vega gasped as his lung partially reinflated. The relief was immediate but temporary. Without a proper chest seal and evacuation to a surgical facility, the pneumothorax would reoccur. "You need a hospital," Bishop said quietly, applying an improvised chest seal made from the plastic wrapper of a field dressing and medical tape. "This is a patch on a sinking boat." Vega managed a weak smile, then stopped talking and started bailing. 2 wounded men now, Bishop with a shrapnel-torn shoulder that was slowly draining his life into the Afghan dirt, Vega with a punctured chest that could collapse again at any moment. The SEAL team's combat effective strength had been cut to 4 men, and those 4 were running low on everything that kept soldiers alive: ammunition, water, time. Reeves assessed the situation and felt the weight of command pressing down on him like the canyon walls themselves. The TBI headache had receded to a dull throb, manageable but present, a reminder that his body was a weapon with a crack in its barrel. He could function, he could fight, but he could not guarantee that the next surge of pain would not drop him again at the worst possible moment. He looked at his remaining fighters. Cole behind his sniper rifle, methodical and deadly, but down to 6 rounds for the MK-13 and 2 magazines for his M4. Mercer in his depression, somehow still finding wisecracks between bursts of fire. But his face was tight with the strain of a man who understood their situation with brutal clarity. Drake, the youngest, who had become something different in the last 30 minutes, something harder and more capable. His hands steady on his weapon as he maintained his position near the SATCOM unit. And then Reeves heard the sound that told him their time was running out faster than he had calculated. The whistle came from the south this time. A different mortar position, one that Elena had not identified before her attack on the first team. The round impacted 25 meters away, and before the dust had settled, a second whistle announced another round from a third position to the west. Karimi had activated his remaining mortar team simultaneously, creating a converging barrage that would systematically reduce the SEALs' survivable area to nothing. "Multiple mortar positions," Mercer shouted. "They've got us triangulated." The rounds began falling in a pattern that revealed professional fire direction. Each impact was carefully adjusted from the last, walking the explosions closer to the American position from 3 different angles. The enemy forward observers could see the green smoke that still lingered near the SEALs' location, and they were using it as a reference point to guide their fire with lethal precision. Reeves keyed his radio to Elena. "Lightning 6, we've got 3 active mortar positions now. They're triangulating on our position. We cannot stay here. We cannot." Elena banked her crippled A-10 and searched the canyon floor through her flickering targeting pod. The system was degrading further with each minute of flight. The damage from the ZU-23 hits spreading through the aircraft's electronics like an infection. She could make out the general layout of the canyon, but fine detail was becoming difficult. Smoke and dust from the mortar impacts obscured much of the ground. She found one mortar position, a puff of smoke betraying its location behind a rock outcropping 300 meters west of the SEALs. She could see the crew, 4 men working the tube with the efficient movements of trained operators. A second position was harder to locate, somewhere in the rubble field created by her earlier rocket attack. The third she could not find at all. "Bravo 6, I can see one mortar position clearly. I can engage, but I need to tell you something first." She paused. The words she was about to speak would violate a direct order from her chain of command. They would also be the most honest words she had spoken all day. "I was ordered to return to base 20 minutes ago. I refused. I am currently in violation of a direct order from Bagram AWACS. If I make another attack run and this aircraft goes down, there will be consequences for people beyond just me." The silence on the radio lasted 2 seconds. "Lightning 6, Reeves replied, and his voice carried something that went beyond gratitude, beyond respect, into a territory that only people who have faced death together can understand. "We hear you, and we will remember." "Then let's make it count. Coming in hot." Elena pushed her single remaining engine to maximum power and rolled into her attack dive. The A-10 responded with a shudder that ran through the entire airframe, metal protesting against forces it was no longer fully designed to withstand. Warning lights that had been amber were now red. The hydraulic system pressure gauge was bouncing against 0 with each control input. The flight stick felt like she was trying to steer through wet concrete. But the GAU-8 cannons still worked, and that was all she needed. She lined up on the mortar position and fired. The cannon roared for what she knew might be the last time, sending a burst of 30mm rounds into the enemy position. The mortar tube vanished in a cloud of dust and fragmented rock. The crew ceased to exist. Secondary explosions from stored ammunition sent a fireball climbing into the gray sky. 1 mortar position destroyed, 2 remained. The ZU-23 gunners were ready for her this time. Tracers from 2 positions converged on her aircraft as she pulled out of the dive, and Elena felt impacts along her fuselage that sent new vibrations through the airframe. A chunk of her right horizontal stabilizer tore away, visible in her mirrors as a dark shape tumbling into the canyon below. The aircraft's nose yawed sharply to the right, and she fought the controls with both hands, muscling the A-10 back into level flight through raw physical strength. "I'm hit again," she transmitted, her voice strained from the effort of controlling the damaged aircraft. "Lost part of my stabilizer. Flight controls are severely degraded. I can maintain altitude, but I cannot make another attack run. I am Winchester on effective offensive capability." Winchester. The word meant she was done, out of the fight, a flying observer with no ability to influence the battle below. But not quite, not yet. Below her, the remaining 2 mortar teams continued their barrage. Rounds fell closer and closer to the SEAL position, and Reeves knew with mathematical certainty that they had minutes before a direct hit killed or wounded someone else. They could not stay in their current position. But moving men exposing themselves to sniper fire from the canyon walls and the advancing ground fighters that Vega, even in his wounded state, had reported closing from the east and south. "We have to move," Reeves announced to his team. "The mortars have our position dialed in. If we stay here, we die." "Move where?" Cole asked. It was not a challenge. It was a legitimate tactical question from a man who had studied the terrain through his scope and seen nothing that looked like salvation. Reeves pulled up the mental map he had been building since the ambush began. The canyon ran roughly northeast to southwest, with their current position near the eastern wall about two-thirds of the way from the canyon's northern entrance. The extraction point, the landing zone where helicopters could theoretically set down, was 400 meters to the southwest, near the wider section of the canyon where the walls dropped low enough to allow rotor clearance. Between here and there lay open ground, scattered boulders, and an unknown number of enemy fighters. But there was something else, something that Elena's rocket attack in the earlier fighting had created. When the 14 Hydra 70 rockets had detonated along the western canyon wall, the explosions had triggered massive rock slides that deposited tons of debris onto the canyon floor. That debris field now formed a ridge of broken stone roughly 2 meters high and 60 meters long, running parallel to their route toward the extraction point. It was not a wall, it would not stop bullets. But it would break line of sight from the eastern canyon positions and provide intermittent cover for movement. The rockets had carved them a path, a bad path, a dangerous path, but a path. "We move along the debris ridge from the rocket strikes," Reeves said. "It gives us partial cover toward the LZ. Cole, you take point. Mercer, you've got rear. Drake, help me with Vega. Bishop, can you move on your own?" Bishop's face was gray. His lips were dry and cracked, but his eyes were clear and his voice was steady. "I can move. Don't wait for me and don't carry me. I'll keep up." It was the statement of a man who understood that being carried meant slowing the team, and slowing the team meant people died. Bishop would walk on his own 2 feet, or he would die trying. That was the calculus of brotherhood in extremis. "Mercer, before we move, can you do anything about those remaining mortars?" Mercer checked his demolitions kit. The C4 charges he had brought for the reconnaissance mission were designed for breaching obstacles and destroying intelligence targets, not for attacking fortified mortar positions across hundreds of meters of open ground. He had used one charge to destroy the first mortar position during his earlier assault, a mission that had nearly killed him. The remaining charges were insufficient for another direct attack. But Mercer was not thinking about direct attacks. He was thinking about distractions. "I can't reach them," Mercer said, "but I can make them think I'm trying. Give me 2 minutes and every charge I've got left." He worked quickly, his hands moving with the assured precision of a man who had spent a decade learning how to make things explode. He placed his remaining C4 charges at 3 points along their current perimeter, each rigged with a remote detonator and augmented with rocks and debris to create maximum fragmentation. They would not damage the mortar positions, but they would create explosions large enough to draw attention and momentarily disrupt the enemy's coordination. "Ready, on your signal." Reeves looked at his team one final time. 4 men who could fight, 2 who could barely move, a pilot circling above in an aircraft that was dying by degrees, and 400 meters of hell between them and the only place on Earth where a helicopter could land. "Elena," he said, dropping the call sign formality for the first time, "can you talk us through what you see? Guide us from up there?" Elena looked down at the canyon through her damaged sensors and understood what Reeves was asking. She could not shoot, she could not bomb, but she could see. From 15,000 feet, even with degraded optics, she had a perspective that the men on the ground would never have. She could spot enemy movements, identify threats, guide the team through gaps in the enemy positions. "I've got you, Bravo 6. I'll be your eyes." "Mercer, now." The 3 C4 charges detonated in rapid sequence, each explosion sending a column of dust and debris into the air on the eastern side of their perimeter. The blasts were deliberately placed to simulate a breakout attempt toward the east, away from the actual direction of movement. For 5 precious seconds, every Taliban fighter in the canyon looked east, expecting to see Americans charging through the smoke. The SEALs moved west. Cole went first, flowing through the rocks with the fluid grace of a man born to mountain terrain. His Montana upbringing had given him an instinctive understanding of how to move through broken ground, how to use every undulation and shadow to mask his silhouette. He covered the first 50 meters to the debris ridge in under 30 seconds, sliding into the cover of a collapsed section of canyon wall that rose chest-high above the floor. "Clear to the ridge, move." Drake had Vega's arm over his shoulder, half carrying the wounded reconnaissance specialist through the rocks. Vega tried to help, his legs working even as each step sent bolts of pain through his damaged chest. The improvised chest seal held, but every exertion pushed air through the wound in ways that threatened to undo Bishop's emergency treatment. Vega's breathing was a wet rasp that Drake tried not to listen to because listening to it made him think about what was happening inside Vega's chest and thinking about that would slow him down. Reeves moved alongside them, his weapon up, scanning the canyon walls for the muzzle flash that would announce someone had spotted their movement. The C4 distraction had bought them seconds, not minutes, and every second was a gift that could be revoked without notice. Bishop moved on his own as he had promised. He moved badly. Each step was a negotiation between his will to survive and his body's insistence that survival was no longer a reasonable expectation. His wounded shoulder screamed with every footfall, the impact traveling through his skeleton to the torn muscle and severed tendons. Blood continued to seep through the saturated bandage, leaving a trail on the rocks behind him that he knew the enemy would find and follow. But he moved, step by step, rock by rock. He moved. Mercer came last, walking backward, his weapon covering the direction they had come from. He moved the way Marines are trained to move in retrograde, smooth and controlled, and ready to engage anything that appeared behind them. Every few meters he would pause, crouch, scan, then continue. The former Marine was the team's rear guard, the last line between the enemy and his wounded teammates. And he carried that responsibility with the quiet ferocity of a man who had taken a personal oath to ensure no one was left behind. They reached the debris ridge. Elena watched from above, her heart hammering as she tracked the team's movement against the backdrop of enemy positions. She could see Taliban fighters beginning to realize the distraction had been a feint. Heads were turning, weapons were reorienting, the window was closing. Bravo 6, you've got fighters repositioning to your south. Approximately 15 moving fast. They'll have line of sight on the ridge in about 2 minutes. Copy, moving. They pushed south along the debris ridge, using the broken wall of stone as a shield against the eastern canyon positions. The ridge was not continuous. Gaps appeared every 20 or 30 meters where the rock slide had not deposited enough material to form cover, and each gap required a sprint across open ground that could be observed from the canyon walls. Cole navigated each gap the same way. A pause, a scan through his scope, a sprint that lasted no more than 3 seconds, then cover on the other side and a call for the next man. At the third gap, the enemy found them. A burst of AK fire shattered the rock face 3 feet from Drake's head as he carried Vega across the open space. Stone fragments peppered his face and neck, drawing blood but not stopping his movement. He dove behind the next section of ridge with Vega clutched to his chest, both men hitting the ground hard. Vega made a sound that was not a scream and not a groan, but something between the two, a noise that only comes from a man whose damaged lung has just been compressed by impact. "Contact south!" Cole shouted, already returning fire at the muzzle flashes. His MK-13 barked twice. 2 of his last 6 sniper rounds spent to suppress the fighters who had spotted their movement. 2 enemies fell, the rest ducked, buying another 30 seconds of movement. Bishop crossed the gap at something between a jog and a controlled fall. Mercer sprinted across without a word, turned, and began laying down fire at the southern positions. They kept moving, 200 meters to go. Elena circled above and watched the race unfold on her screens. She could see everything with terrible clarity. The SEAL team moving south along the debris ridge like figures in a deadly obstacle course. Enemy fighters converging from 3 directions. The remaining mortar teams adjusting their aim to the team's new position. And behind the SEALs, the blocking force that Karimi had sent through the goat trail was emerging onto the canyon floor, cutting off any possibility of retreat. Bravo 6, you have a new problem. Enemy force has appeared behind you to the northeast. 12 to 15 fighters. They've sealed off your 6. Reeves did not look back. There was nothing behind them anymore except death. Copy. We press forward. At 150 meters from the extraction point, the canyon began to widen. The walls dropped from 300 meters to 150, and the floor opened into a broader area strewn with boulders and dry creek beds. This was where the helicopters would land. This was where rescue would arrive, if it arrived at all. But the wider canyon also meant less cover from the debris ridge, which petered out as the rock slide deposits thinned. And it was here that Elena made the decision that changed everything. She looked at her fuel gauge. 8 minutes remaining. Her engine temperature was climbing toward the red line. The flight controls responded to her inputs with a delay that grew longer with each passing minute as hydraulic fluid continued to drain from the system. She had no weapons, no cannon rounds, no rockets, no bombs. She was flying a crippled, unarmed aircraft over a battlefield where her allies were about to be overrun. But she had the aircraft itself, 70,000 pounds of titanium and steel moving through the air at 300 knots. And she had the sound. Bravo 6, I'm going to make a low pass. Below the canyon rim, I need everyone flat on the ground when I come through. Reeves understood immediately. Copy, Lightning 6, we're down. Every SEAL pressed flat against the earth. Elena pushed her throttle to full military power on her single remaining engine and dove into the canyon. Not at altitude, not at safe distance. She dropped below the rim of the canyon walls and flew through the interior of the valley itself, her wingtips seeming to brush the rock faces on either side. The A-10 screamed through the canyon at 250 knots, 50 feet above the ground, its single engine producing a roar that echoed and amplified off the stone walls until it sounded like the fury of God channeled through a concrete tunnel. The effect on the Taliban fighters was devastating. Not physically, because she carried no weapons, but psychologically. The last time this aircraft had flown low through the canyon, it had unleashed 14 rockets that had collapsed entire sections of the wall and killed dozens of fighters. Every surviving Taliban fighter in that canyon carried the memory of that apocalyptic barrage in his bones. And when the A-10 came screaming through again, every instinct in their bodies told them the same thing. Take cover or die. Fighters dove behind rocks. Mortar crews abandoned their tubes. The advancing ground forces that had been closing on the SEALs' route stopped dead and pressed themselves into the ground. For 15 seconds, not a single shot was fired in the canyon. 15 seconds of silence in a place that had been filled with a continuous roar of combat for over an hour. 15 seconds. Enough for the SEALs to cover another 50 meters. Elena pulled up and out of the canyon, her engine screaming in protest, the airframe shuddering with vibrations that she could feel in her teeth. A new warning light appeared, engine oil pressure dropping. The single engine that was keeping her in the sky was beginning to fail. She climbed back to altitude and began circling again, watching her gauges with the clinical detachment of a pilot who has accepted that she may not make it home. Bravo 6, that's the last time I can do that. Engine is failing. I estimate 5 minutes of flight time remaining. On the ground, Reeves processed this information and made the calculations that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 5 minutes of air cover, 15 minutes until the rescue helicopters were supposed to arrive, 10 minutes of gap where they would be alone on the ground with no air support, no ammunition, and an enemy that outnumbered them 8-1. They were 100 meters from the extraction point, close enough to see the open ground where a helicopter could land, close enough to imagine the sound of rotors and the wash of downdraft that would mean salvation. But 100 meters was an eternity when every meter was contested by men who wanted you dead. Cole, what do you see at the LZ? Cole scanned the landing zone through his scope. It's open, flat ground, maybe 60 meters across. But there are firing positions on the western wall that overlook it. If we're in the open when the helos come in, we're targets, and so are the helicopters. Reeves absorbed this. Even if they reached the extraction point, even if the helicopters arrived on time, the landing zone was under observation from enemy positions. Any aircraft attempting to land would be engaged by fighters on the canyon walls. The helicopters would be flying into the same trap that had caught the SEALs on the ground. He needed to warn them. He turned to Drake. Get on the SATCOM, tell Wolverine Base that the LZ is hot. Enemy positions overlooking the landing zone from the west. Helicopters will need gunship escort and suppression before landing. Drake transmitted the warning, his voice calm and professional despite the chaos around him. The response from FOB Wolverine confirmed what they already knew. Dustoff 72, the MEDEVAC Blackhawk, was inbound with Captain James Warren at the controls. 2 Apache AH-64D gunships were following, but were delayed. Mechanical issue on Apache 2 had required a hot swap of a hydraulic actuator. The Apaches were now 12 minutes out. Dustoff 72 was 8 minutes out and closing fast. Warren was coming in ahead of his escorts, because that was what MEDEVAC pilots did. They flew toward the sound of guns, toward the wounded, toward the dying, and they did not wait for conditions to be perfect, because conditions were never perfect when men were bleeding. The red cross on the side of a dust-off helicopter was not a shield. It was a declaration. We are coming to get our people, and nothing will stop us. Elena heard the transmission and felt ice form in her stomach. A Black Hawk flying into a canyon with active anti-aircraft positions and no Apache escort. She knew what Karimi had been saving those SA-7 missiles for. She knew with the certainty of someone who had spent 3 years studying the enemy's tactics that the MEDEVAC helicopter was flying into a trap. "Bravo 6, she said, and her voice carried an urgency that cut through the static like a blade. "The MEDEVAC cannot enter this canyon without Apache escort. I repeat, warn Dustoff 72 to hold position until the Apaches arrive. Karimi has anti-aircraft missiles. I have not been able to locate them, but they are in this canyon. If that helicopter comes in alone, he will shoot it down." Reeves keyed the SATCOM immediately. "Wolverine Base, Bravo 6, relay to Dustoff 72, do not enter the canyon without Apache escort. Enemy has man-pads capability. I say again, suspected shoulder-fired missiles in the area." The response came back 10 seconds later, and the words in it carried the quiet determination of a pilot who had already made his decision. "Bravo 6, Wolverine Base relays. Dustoff 72 acknowledges the threat. Captain Warren states he is continuing approach. His words are, quote, I am not leaving wounded men waiting while I circle outside. Tell them I am coming," end quote. Reeves closed his eyes for 1 second. 1 second to absorb the weight of what was about to happen. A man he had never met was about to fly a helicopter into a canyon full of missiles because Reeves's men were bleeding, and that man had taken an oath that wounded soldiers would never wait. He opened his eyes. "Copy. Tell Warren we'll have the LZ as secure as we can make it." Elena had 4 minutes of fuel left. Below her, a MEDEVAC helicopter was racing toward a canyon where missiles waited. Behind the SEALs, 40 fighters were regrouping for a final assault. 2 of the SEALs were critically wounded. The storm clouds were now visible as a solid wall of gray moving down from the mountains, close enough that Elena could see snow swirling in the upper reaches. She checked her cannon ammunition counter one final time. The digital readout showed 47 rounds, enough for approximately 1 second of fire, not enough to destroy an anti-aircraft position, not enough to suppress a mortar team, not enough to stop an assault, but perhaps enough for one final act. She had been searching for the SA-7 positions since the battle began, scanning every cave mouth and shadow along the canyon walls for the telltale signature of a missile team. She had not found them because Karimi had hidden them well, inside caves with narrow openings that did not face upward, positions that would only be revealed at the moment of launch when the missile operators stepped out to acquire their target. Elena could not find the missiles before they launched, but she could predict where they would launch from. The canyon's geometry limited the possible positions. A shoulder-fired missile needed line of sight to its target and enough open sky for the missile to track. In this canyon, that meant the western wall near the wider section where the helicopters would approach. And there were only 3 cave openings on that wall with the right angle and exposure. 3 possible positions, 47 rounds, 1 second of fire. The math was impossible. The math had been impossible all day. Elena Graves had stopped caring about math the moment she refused the order to return to base. She marked the 3 positions in her memory, committed their locations to the part of her mind that did not forget, the part that had been trained at flight school and sharpened over 3 years of combat. Then she keyed her radio one final time. "Bravo 6, Lightning 6, I have 4 minutes of fuel and 47 cannon rounds. When Dustoff 72 enters the canyon, I will engage any missile launch I can identify. After that, my aircraft is done. It has been an honor flying for you today." Reeves heard the words and understood their full weight. The pilot above him was not just offering to make one final attack run. She was offering to spend her last moments of flight time protecting a helicopter instead of flying towards safety. If her engine failed during that final act, there was no ejection seat on an A-10 at low altitude inside a canyon. There was only a crash. Lightning 6, the honor is ours. Mercer, who had been listening to the exchange while covering the rear, looked up at the thin trail of smoke that marked Elena's aircraft against the darkening sky. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright. "That," he said to Cole, "is the kind of pilot you write songs about." Cole did not reply. He chambered one of his last 4 sniper rounds, pressed his eye to the scope, and began scanning the western canyon wall for cave openings. 100 meters to the landing zone. 8 minutes until Dustoff 72 arrived. 12 until the Apaches. 4 until Elena's fuel ran out. 40-plus enemy fighters closing from 3 directions. 2 SA-7 missiles waiting in the shadows. The longest hour was not over. The worst of it was just beginning. Captain James Warren flew his Black Hawk helicopter through the narrowing mouth of the canyon at 120 knots, with the steady hands of a man who had made peace with what was coming. The aircraft designation painted on the fuselage read Dust-Off 72, and below that designation was a red cross that meant this helicopter existed for one purpose only: to bring wounded soldiers home. Warren had been flying MEDEVAC missions for 9 years across 3 combat deployments, and in that time he had never once refused a call. Not when the landing zone was under fire, not when the weather was impossible, not when intelligence reported threats that would make any rational pilot turn around. He was not a rational pilot, he was a dust-off pilot, and there was a difference. Behind him in the cabin, his crew chief, Sergeant First Class Maria Sandoval, checked the medical equipment for the 3rd time and tried not to think about the SA-7 warning that had been relayed from the ground team. Beside her, Flight Medic Staff Sergeant Kevin Park prepared IV bags and surgical kits with the focused efficiency of a man who knew that every second saved in the air was a second of life for whoever they pulled off that canyon floor. The co-pilot, Chief Warrant Officer 3 David Chen, monitored the instruments and scanned the canyon walls through his night vision goggles, searching for threats that he desperately hoped he would not find. 4 souls aboard Dust-Off 72, flying towards 6 on the ground. The mathematics of rescue were always simple. You went because they needed you. Everything else was details. Warren could see the canyon opening ahead, the walls rising on either side like the jaws of something enormous and hungry. The gray sky pressed down from above, storm clouds rolling in from the north with a speed that left no room for delay. Snow was already falling on the highest peaks. In 20 minutes, maybe less, visibility would drop to 0 and no helicopter in the inventory would be able to navigate these mountains. Dust-Off 72 is 3 minutes out, Warren transmitted on the common frequency. Bravo 6, confirm LZ status. On the ground, Reeves had pushed his team to within 50 meters of the landing zone. They were sheltered behind a cluster of boulders at the edge of the wider canyon section, close enough to see the flat ground where the helicopter would land, close enough to hear the distant thud of rotor blades echoing off the canyon walls. Dust-Off 72, Bravo 6. LZ is not secure. I say again, LZ is hot. Enemy positions on the western wall overlooking the landing zone. We have been unable to suppress. Recommend you hold for Apache escort. Warren's response was immediate. Negative, Bravo 6. My Apaches are 10 minutes behind me, and your wounded don't have 10 minutes. I'm coming in. Pop smoke on the LZ and keep your heads down. Reeves looked at Bishop, whose eyes were half closed and whose skin had taken on the waxy translucence that medics recognize as the last stage before circulatory collapse. He looked at Vega, whose breathing came in wet, labored gasps through the improvised chest seal that was slowly failing. Bishop had maybe 30 minutes. Vega had less. Warren was right. They did not have 10 minutes. Copy. Dust-Off 72. Smoke out. Reeves pulled his last smoke grenade and threw it onto the landing zone. Purple smoke billowed upward into the gray sky, marking the spot where salvation would either arrive or be destroyed. Elena saw the Black Hawk from her altitude, a dark shape moving fast along the canyon floor, rotors churning the dust and smoke into spiraling vortexes. She also saw what Warren could not see from his approach angle. On the western canyon wall, approximately 200 meters from the landing zone, a figure emerged from a cave opening. Then a second figure. They were carrying something long and cylindrical between them. The SA-7 launch tube. Dust-Off 72. Break right. Break right. Missile team on the west wall, 200 meters north of the LZ. Elena did not wait for a response. She pushed her dying engine to full power and dove toward the western wall, aiming for the cave opening where the missile team was setting up. 47 rounds, 1 second of fire. She would get one chance to hit a target the size of 2 men standing on a ledge, from a diving approach in a crippled aircraft with degraded targeting systems. The missile team was fast. They had trained for this moment for weeks under Karimi's supervision, rehearsing the sequence until it was automatic. Shoulder the launch tube, acquire the target, wait for the infrared seeker to lock onto the helicopter's engine heat signature. The SA-7's seeker head emitted a distinctive growling tone that changed to a steady, high-pitched whine when it achieved lock. The process took 4 seconds. Elena had 3. She fired. The GAU-8 erupted for the final time, burning through 47 rounds in less than a second. The stream of depleted uranium projectiles hammered into the rock face around the cave opening, sending stone fragments and dust exploding outward. One round struck the lead missile operator in the chest and passed through him like he was made of paper. Another hit the launch tube itself, shattering the guidance section. But the second missile team was not where she expected. Karimi had positioned two teams, not one. The second SA-7 was 300 meters south of the first, in a position that Elena had not identified because it was hidden behind a rock overhang that was invisible from above. The backup team. Karimi's insurance policy. The lesson of a man who had survived 40 years of warfare by always having a contingency. The second SA-7 fired. The missile left the launch tube with a rush of flame and white smoke. Its infrared seeker already locked onto the hot exhaust of dust-off 72's twin General Electric T-700 engines. Warren saw the launch. Every MEDEVAC pilot trained for this moment. The flash of ignition, the corkscrew trail of smoke, the knowledge that you had approximately 3 seconds to react before the warhead arrived. Warren's hands moved with the speed of pure instinct. He punched the flare dispenser, releasing a stream of white-hot magnesium decoys that bloomed behind the aircraft like a constellation of false suns. Simultaneously, he threw the Black Hawk into a hard right bank, trying to put the canyon wall between his aircraft and the missile's seeker head. In open sky, the maneuver might have worked. The flares might have seduced the missile's infrared tracker away from the engines. But they were not in open sky. They were inside a canyon 150 meters wide, with stone walls rising on both sides. The hard bank that would have saved them in the open brought the Black Hawk's rotor dangerously close to the eastern wall. Warren corrected, pulling back left, and in that moment of correction, the missile's seeker reacquired the engines through the fading flare pattern. The SA-7 warhead detonated against the tail section of Dust-Off 72. The explosion was not large by the standards of the weapons that had been used in this canyon. The SA-7 carried a relatively small fragmentation warhead designed to damage aircraft, not destroy buildings. But it was enough. The tail rotor disintegrated. The drive shaft sheared. The anti-torque system that kept the helicopter from spinning ceased to exist in a single violent instant. Without the tail rotor, a helicopter becomes an uncontrollable spinning mass of metal and momentum. The fuselage began to rotate, slowly at first, then with increasing speed as the main rotor's torque went unopposed. Warren fought the controls with everything he had, every hour of training and experience channeled through his hands into the collective encyclic that no longer responded the way physics demanded. He could not save the aircraft. He knew that in the first half second, but he could choose where it came down. The landing zone was directly below, flat ground. If the helicopter hit the rocks or the canyon wall, everyone aboard would die. If he could keep it over the flat ground and reduce their rate of descent, there was a chance, a small chance. The kind of chance that dust-off pilots had been taking for decades, since the first time a man in a helicopter decided that wounded soldiers mattered more than his own survival. Warren pulled maximum collective pitch, trading rotor speed for lift in a maneuver that would slow their descent but accelerate the spin. The Black Hawk came down hard, not a landing, not a crash landing. Something between the two, a controlled impact that sent the aircraft slamming into the flat ground of the landing zone at an angle that crumpled the landing gear, shattered the cockpit glass, and drove the airframe into the dirt with a force that compressed Warren's spine and shattered both his legs below the knee. The helicopter slid 30 meters across the rocky ground, throwing sparks and debris before coming to rest on its left side in a cloud of dust and smoke. The main rotor struck the ground and disintegrated, sending blade fragments spinning through the air like massive shrapnel. The engines wound down with a dying whine that seemed to echo forever in the sudden relative silence. On the ground, the SEALs watched the impact with the horror of men who understood exactly what had just been lost. Their rescue, their way out. The helicopter that was supposed to carry their wounded to safety was now a smoking wreck on the landing zone, and the people inside it had just become casualties themselves. Move to the crash site," Reeves commanded, and the team began covering the 50 meters to the downed helicopter with everything they had left. Drake was the fastest. He reached the wreckage first, climbing over the crumpled fuselage to the cockpit where Warren was pinned in his seat. The pilot was conscious. His face was a mask of blood from glass cuts, and his legs were bent at angles that made Drake's stomach lurch. But Warren's eyes were open and focused. "My crew," Warren said. The first words out of his mouth were not about his own shattered legs or the blood pooling in his flight suit. "Check my crew." Drake moved to the cabin. Sandoval was unconscious, hanging from her harness with blood running from a gash on her forehead. Park was alert, already cutting himself free from his straps with a knife, one arm hanging limp where the shoulder had been dislocated by the impact. Chen, the co-pilot, was pinned by a section of the instrument panel that had collapsed into his lap. He was conscious and in obvious pain, but his injuries appeared survivable. "Three survivors, one unconscious," Drake called out to Reeves. "The pilot's alive, but his legs are broken bad. They need Bishop." Bishop was already there. The medic who could barely stand, who had been bleeding for over an hour from a shoulder wound that should have put him in an operating room, dragged himself to the wreckage and began triaging the helicopter crew with one functioning hand. His medical training overrode everything else. Pain, blood loss, exhaustion, all of it became irrelevant when there were patients who needed him. "Warren is priority 2. Both legs are compound fractures but no arterial bleeding," Bishop assessed with the rapid clinical detachment of a man running on training and adrenaline. "Sandoval is priority 1. Possible traumatic brain injury, unresponsive. Chen is priority 3. He can wait. Park, get over here and help me. You've got one good arm, and I've got one good arm. Between us, we've got a whole medic." Park, the flight medic, popped his dislocated shoulder back in with a grunt of agony and moved to help Bishop. Two wounded medical professionals working together, each compensating for the other's injuries. It was the kind of improvisation that saved lives when everything else had failed. Reeves took stock of the new reality. 6 SEALs, 2 critically wounded, 4 helicopter crew, 3 wounded, 1 unconscious and possibly dying. 10 people total. Their rescue helicopter was now a wreck. The Apaches were still 8 minutes out. The storm was closing fast, and the enemy had just watched their helicopter get shot down, which meant Karimi now knew that the Americans were stranded. The wreckage of Dust-Off 72, however, offered something that Reeves's tactical mind immediately recognized: cover. The downed Black Hawk, even crumpled and smoking, was the largest piece of hard cover on the landing zone. Its armored fuselage could stop small arms fire. Its bulk provided concealment from multiple angles, and its cargo included things that the SEALs desperately needed. "Mercer, get into that wreck and find me weapons and ammunition, anything we can use." Mercer climbed into the cabin and began searching with the enthusiasm of a man who had just found an oasis in a desert. The Black Hawk's standard MEDEVAC loadout did not include offensive weapons, but the crew had been armed. He found Sandoval's M4 carbine with 6 full magazines, Chen's M9 pistol with 3 magazines, a case of smoke grenades, and buried under a pile of medical supplies, the crew chief's personal weapon, an M4 with an M203 grenade launcher mounted beneath the barrel, and 4 high-explosive 40mm grenades. Mercer held up the grenade launcher like a man who had just been handed a gift from heaven. Christmas came early, boys. But the real prize was something else entirely. Mounted on the cabin floor, its ammunition belt still loaded and its electric motor still functional, was the Black Hawk's M134 minigun. The weapon was designed to be fired from the helicopter's door mount, a 6-barreled rotary machine gun capable of firing 4,000 rounds per minute of 7.62mm ammunition. The impact had torn it from its mount, but the weapon itself appeared undamaged. The belt-fed ammunition box beside it held 800 rounds. The minigun was too heavy to carry and had no tripod for ground use. But Mercer was not thinking about carrying it. He was thinking about what he could do with 800 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, an electric motor, and the C4 detonators in his demolitions kit. "Give me 5 minutes," Mercer said to Reeves. "I'm going to build us a perimeter." While Mercer worked, Reeves organized the defense of the crash site. Cole took position on the high side of the wreckage, using the fuselage as a bench rest for his sniper rifle. He had 4 rounds left for the MK-13 and 3 magazines for his M4, plus the ammunition Mercer had recovered from the crew. It was more than they had possessed 10 minutes ago, and Cole intended to make every round count. Vega, despite his punctured chest and labored breathing, insisted on maintaining his position watching the eastern approaches. Reeves argued. Vega refused. "I can still see, and I can still shoot. Put me where I'm useful, or I'll put myself there." Reeves relented and positioned Vega behind a section of the tail boom that provided cover while giving him a clear view east. Drake split his time between the SATCOM, maintaining their fragile link to FOB Wolverine and providing security on the southern perimeter. He had Sandoval's M4 now, and the additional magazines gave him more ammunition than he had carried since the battle began. The weight of the extra magazines in his vest was reassuring in a way that words could never be. Reeves himself took the northern sector, facing back up the canyon toward the direction the enemy ground forces had been advancing from. He could see movement in the rocks 300 meters out. Karimi's fighters regrouping, preparing for what Reeves knew would be the final assault. They had watched the helicopter go down. They knew the Americans were trapped, and they knew that if they did not finish this now, more aircraft would come. Mercer worked fast. He disconnected the minigun's ammunition belt and divided the 800 rounds into 3 groups. The first group he packed into an ammunition box from the helicopter and positioned it at the base of a boulder 20 meters north of the wreck, facing the main avenue of enemy approach. Around the box he packed rocks and debris, creating an improvised claymore. The M134's electric motor would fire the rounds in a single devastating burst when triggered by a remote detonator wired to one of his remaining initiators. The second and third groups he set up the same way, covering the eastern and western approaches. 3 Claymore-type devices, each containing over 200 rounds of 7.62 millimeter ammunition, positioned to create overlapping kill zones around the crash site. 3 party favors, set and armed, Mercer reported. Anyone who walks into that perimeter is going to have a very bad day. He paused and looked at the M203 grenade launcher he had recovered. 4 high-explosive rounds. Effective range 350 meters. Not much, but in the confines of the canyon, 4 explosions could break a charge and scatter an advancing force. Redneck engineering at its finest, he said, loading the first grenade. Above the canyon, Elena was dying by degrees along with her aircraft. The single remaining engine was running hot, oil pressure dropping in a steady decline that told her the lubrication system had been damaged. When the oil ran out, the engine would seize, and 70,000 pounds of aircraft would become the world's most expensive glider. In a canyon, with walls on both sides, she estimated 3 minutes of engine life remained. Her fuel was even more critical. The gauge had stopped showing numbers and was now simply displaying a red warning light that pulsed like an accusation. She was flying on fumes and faith. She had watched the dust-off go down. She had watched the missile she failed to stop arc across the canyon and destroy the one thing that could have saved those men on the ground. Her 47 rounds had killed the first missile team, but missed the second. And now the helicopter crew that had come to rescue the SEALs needed rescuing themselves. The guilt was a physical thing, heavy in her chest, pressing against her ribs from inside. She should have found the second position. She should have been more thorough in her search. She should have done something differently, something better, something that would have kept that Black Hawk in the air and those men unbroken. But guilt was a luxury for people who had time, and Elena had none. What she did have was an aircraft that still flew, barely, and the knowledge that the men below still needed her even though she had nothing left to give them. No weapons, no fuel, no time, except the bluff, the terrible, beautiful bluff. She keyed her radio, Bravo 6, Lightning 6, I have no ordnance and approximately 2 minutes of fuel. I'm going to make low passes over the canyon to delay the enemy assault. They don't know I'm empty. Every pass I make buys you time. Reeves understood what she was saying. She was going to fly her crippled, fuelless aircraft through the canyon at low altitude, again and again, using nothing but engine noise and the enemy's fear of the A-10 to keep them at bay. Each pass risked her life. Each pass brought her closer to the moment when the engine would quit and the aircraft would fall out of the sky with no possibility of recovery. Lightning 6, you've done enough. Get out while you can. Negative, Bravo 6, not while you're still on the ground. She dove into the canyon. The first pass was at 100 feet above the canyon floor. Engine screaming, the roar amplified by the stone walls until it sounded like the world was ending. Taliban fighters who had been advancing toward the crash site dove for cover. Mortar crews abandoned their tubes. For 10 seconds, the advance stopped. Elena pulled up and circled. The engine temperature gauge was in the red. Oil pressure was critical. She could feel the engine vibrating in ways that meant bearings were failing. Metal grinding against metal without lubrication. She dove again. The second pass was lower than the first, close enough to the ground that her jet wash kicked up a cloud of dust and debris that rolled across the canyon floor like a sandstorm. Fighters who had been crawling toward the American perimeter were blasted flat by the turbulence. The psychological impact was enormous. Every man on the ground heard the cannon that had torn apart their positions for the past hour, mounted in the nose of the aircraft, screaming over their heads, and every man expected it to fire. It did not fire, but they did not know that, and fear kept them pinned for another precious 10 seconds. Karimi knew. From his command position, the old warrior had been counting. He had counted the cannon bursts. He had estimated the ammunition expenditure. And he knew with the mathematical precision of a man who understood American weapons because Americans had taught him that the A-10 was empty. "The aircraft has no ammunition," he transmitted to his fighters. "It is bluffing. All units advance. Now, this is the final assault. Take the Americans. Kill them all." Elena saw the movement begin from her cockpit, dozens of fighters emerging from covers simultaneously, no longer afraid of the toothless aircraft above them. They were moving toward the crash site from 3 directions, a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the depleted American defenses within minutes. She made one more pass, lower than before, so low that her wingtip nearly scraped a boulder on the canyon floor. The engine was screaming, not with power but with pain, the sound of machinery destroying itself. Fighters flinched as she roared over, but they did not stop this time. They kept advancing. Karimi was right. The bluff was over. Elena pulled up for the last time and felt the engine stutter. A cough, a momentary loss of thrust that dropped the aircraft 50 feet before power returned. The oil was gone. The engine had minutes, maybe less. "Bravo 6, Lightning 6. Her voice was steady, impossibly steady for a woman flying a dead aircraft over a battlefield she could no longer influence. "They've figured it out. Full assault coming your way from 3 directions. I count 30-plus fighters advancing on your position. I have nothing left to give you." She paused. The engine coughed again. "The Apaches are 5 minutes out. Hold for 5 minutes. That's all you need." Reeves looked at the advancing enemy and did the math one final time. 30-plus fighters against 4 effective shooters with limited ammunition and 3 improvised claymores. 5 minutes, 300 seconds. "Copy. Lightning 6. Will hold." He paused. Then, breaking every protocol about radio discipline and operational security, he said what needed to be said. "Elena, thank you. Now go home." "Bravo 6. It's been my honor. Lightning 6 out." Elena turned her dying aircraft toward Bagram and felt the tears come. She did not wipe them away. She let them fall onto the blood-stained collar of her flight suit as she nursed her final minutes of engine life toward the nearest flat ground where she might survive a landing. Behind her, the canyon grew small, and the men inside it grew smaller, and there was nothing left for her to do except listen to the radio and pray. On the ground, the final assault came like a wave. Karimi had committed everything. Every fighter he had left. Every weapon. His veterans led the charge from the north, moving through the rocks with the speed and aggression of men who had been fighting their entire lives. Younger fighters pushed from the east and west, less disciplined, but no less determined. The blocking force from the Goat Trail sealed the southern approach. The Americans were completely surrounded. Reeves saw them coming and felt a calm descend upon him that he recognized from his first firefight 18 years ago. It was the calm that comes when options disappear and the only thing left is the fight itself. No planning, no calculating, no math. Just the weapon in your hands and the men beside you and the absolute refusal to quit. "Here they come. Make every round count. Mercer, claymores on my command." Cole fired his sniper rifle. The MK-13 barked, and a fighter 200 meters out dropped mid-stride, chambered another round, fired, another kill, 2 of his last 4 sniper rounds spent in 3 seconds. 2 enemies removed from the equation. The northern assault force reached the 200-meter mark, 20 fighters advancing in short rushes, using boulders and gullies for cover. Professional, disciplined. "Mercer, North Claymore, now." Mercer triggered the first improvised device. The ammunition box packed with 260 rounds of 7.62 millimeters detonated with a roar that sent a wall of metal fragments seething across the northern approach at waist height. 4 fighters went down instantly. 3 more staggered, wounded. The rest dove for cover, the advance stalled by the unexpected violence of the blast. "That's one," Mercer said, already shouldering the M203. The eastern assault force was closer, 150 meters, and closing, moving fast through the rubble field. Vega saw them from his position behind the tail boom and opened fire with his M4, each burst costing him breath that he could not afford to spend. His shots were accurate, but his rate of fire was slow, limited by the pain of expanding his damaged lungs to support the weapon's recoil. "East Claymore," Reeves ordered. The second device detonated. More screams, more bodies falling among the rocks. The eastern advance faltered. From the west, the third group was closest to the American perimeter, 80 meters and running. Drake saw them and engaged, his M4 hammering controlled bursts at figures that moved from rock to rock with alarming speed. He hit one, missed another, hit a third. West Claymore, now! The final device erupted, and the western assault wave broke apart in a spray of fragmentation and stone dust. But these were Karami's best men, veterans who had survived worse than improvised explosives, and those who lived through the blast kept coming. Mercer rose from cover and fired the M203. The 40-millimeter grenade arced across the canyon and detonated among a cluster of fighters regrouping behind a boulder. The explosion scattered bodies and bought another 10 seconds. 3 grenades remaining. The enemy was adapting. The surviving fighters had identified the positions of the American defenders and were directing concentrated fire at each one. Bullets hammered the helicopter wreckage from 3 sides. A round punched through the fuselage 6 inches from Drake's head. Another struck the rock next to Cole, showering him with fragments. And then Reeves's TBI betrayed him for the second time. The pain came without warning. A white flash behind his eyes that blinded him completely for 2 seconds. He staggered, his weapon dropping, his hands going to his temples as though he could physically hold his skull together. The canyon spun. The sounds of battle faded into a roaring hiss. He went to one knee, then both knees. His vision fractured into a kaleidoscope of light and shadow that contained no useful information. He was blind and deaf in the middle of a firefight, his team fighting for survival 10 feet away, while their commander knelt in the dirt with his brain destroying itself. And this time it lasted longer. Drake saw Reeves go down and felt the floor drop out of his stomach. Not again. Not now. He fired a final burst at the Western attackers, dropped behind the fuselage, and crawled to Reeves's position. The team leader was on his knees, hands pressed against his head, face contorted in agony. His weapon lay beside him. Drake grabbed Reeves's shoulder. "Hawk! Hawk, stay with me!" No response. Just the grinding sound of a man's teeth clamping together against pain that exceeded the capacity of language. Drake looked around the perimeter. Cole was engaging targets to the north. Vega was barely able to fire to the east. Mercer was reloading the M203. No one was covering the south where the blocking force had been waiting. Movement. Drake turned and saw a figure rise from behind a rock 40 meters south. Then another. The southern blocking force, realizing the Americans were focused on 3 other directions, was making their move. Drake raised his weapon and began engaging. 2 fighters went down, but more were coming, using the rocks for cover, advancing in short rushes. Drake tracked a shape, moving fast between 2 boulders, and put his sights on it. Center mass. His finger took up the slack on the trigger. The shape stumbled into a patch of light, and Drake's blood turned to ice. For one terrible second, his combat-addled brain could not reconcile what he was seeing. The figure was low, hunched, moving oddly. Not like a fighter advancing, like a man crawling. And the clothing was wrong, not the earth-toned garments of the Taliban, darker, familiar. It was Reeves. Somehow, in his TBI fugue, the team leader had crawled away from his position and was moving south through the rocks, disoriented, heading directly into Drake's line of fire. Drake's finger was on the trigger. The weapon was aimed at center mass. At this range, 35 meters, he would not miss. His brain had already identified the target as hostile, and his finger was already taking up the final pressure that would send a 3-round burst into the chest of his own team leader. He recognized Reeves with less than a pound of trigger pressure remaining. Drake jerked the barrel up. The rounds cracked over Reeves's head and struck the rock face behind him. Drake's hands shook so violently that he nearly dropped the weapon. He had almost killed Hawk. He had come within a fraction of a second and a fraction of an inch of killing the man who had promised his mother he would bring him home. Drake sprinted to Reeves and grabbed him, physically dragging the disoriented commander back toward the crash site. Reeves's eyes were open but unfocused, his body moving on autopilot without direction from his conscious mind. Drake hauled him behind the fuselage and propped him against the metal skin. "Stay here, stay down, I've got you." In Reeves's breast pocket, against his chest, the letter from Drake's mother pressed between them. Neither knew it was there in that moment. Both would remember it later. Drake returned to the perimeter and took command for the second time that day. "Cole, north and west. Mercer, south. I've got east. Hawk is down again. It's on us." The enemy was 30 meters from the perimeter on three sides. Ammunition was running critical again. Mercer fired his second M203 grenade at the Southern blocking force, scattering them, but they reformed and kept coming. Cole switched from his sniper rifle to Sandoval's M4 and began firing at anything that moved. And at the crash site, Warren, the MEDEVAC pilot with two broken legs who could not stand, who could not walk, who could not do anything except lie in the wreckage of his helicopter and listen to the battle rage around him, reached under his seat and found what he was looking for. His service pistol, the M9 Beretta that every Army aviator carried and prayed they would never need. He could not move to a fighting position. He could not stand behind cover. But he could hold a pistol and he could aim it at the southern approach where enemy fighters were closing on the wreckage that sheltered his wounded crew. Warren propped himself up on his shattered legs, braced the pistol against the crumpled doorframe of his cockpit, and waited. A fighter appeared at 20 meters, AK raised, heading directly for the cabin where Sandoval lay unconscious. Warren fired twice. The fighter fell. Another appeared. Warren fired again. His aim was imperfect, the pain in his legs throwing off his concentration, but at this range, perfection was not required. The second fighter stumbled and dropped. A pilot who could not fly, a sniper running out of bullets, a demolitions expert with 2 grenades left, a wounded man breathing through a hole in his chest, a communications specialist commanding a team on his first deployment, and a medic holding a perimeter together with one arm while treating patients with the other. This was what was left. This was what held the line. Mercer fired his third M203 round and watched it detonate among a group of fighters trying to flank from the west. 2 rounds left, he announced. After that, it's pistols and harsh language. Cole's M4 ran dry. He dropped the magazine, seated his last one, and resumed firing. 30 rounds between him and empty. Drake heard the Apaches before he saw them. A sound that every American soldier in combat recognizes with the same visceral relief that a drowning man feels when his hand closes on a rope. The deep, rhythmic thud of rotor blades cutting through mountain air. Getting louder. Getting closer. He keyed the SATCOM with one hand while firing with the other. Wolverine base, Bravo 6 Romeo. Dustoff 72 is down at the LZ. Multiple casualties. We are in danger of being overrun. Where are my Apaches? The response came through clear for the first time all day, the storm not yet close enough to disrupt the frequency. Bravo 6 Romeo, Apache flight is 2 minutes out. Hang on. 2 minutes. Reeves's eyes focused. The TBI episode was passing, faster this time, as though his brain had learned to fight through the damage the way a broken bone learns to bear weight. He was not fully functional. His vision was blurred at the edges and the pain was a constant presence. But he could see. He could think. He could fight. He heard Drake commanding the defense and felt something that cut through the pain and the guilt and the fear. Pride. The kid from Ohio, the one whose mother had written a letter begging Reeves to keep her son safe, was holding the line. Not just surviving, leading. Reeves picked up his weapon, checked the magazine, and took his place on the perimeter. Bravo 6 is back. Good work, all of you. 2 minutes to Apache. We hold. Mercer looked at Cole. Cole looked at Mercer. Neither said a word. Words were unnecessary between men who had been through what they had been through. They turned back to their sectors and kept fighting. 2 minutes. 120 seconds. An eternity measured in trigger, pulls, and muzzle flashes, and the wet sound of Vega's breathing, and the steady crack of Warren's pistol from the wreckage, and the distant, growing thunder of Apache rotors descending through the gray sky toward the Valley of Shadows. They held. They held. And then the sky opened up, and deliverance came on rotors of steel. The 2 Apache AH-64D gunships crested the canyon rim like avenging angels descending through the gray overcast, their angular silhouettes unmistakable against the storm clouds gathering behind them. Apache flight, call signs Warpath 1 and Warpath 2 carried enough firepower to level a small town. Each helicopter mounted a 30mm M230 chain gun beneath its chin, 4 Hellfire anti-tank missiles on the inner wing pylons, and 19 shot pods of Hydra 70 rockets on the outer stations. They were designed for one purpose, the systematic destruction of everything in their path. The lead Apache pilot, Captain Rachel Nguyen, surveyed the battlefield through her helmet-mounted display. The thermal system painted the canyon in shades of green and white, muzzle flashes everywhere. A downed helicopter on the landing zone. American positions clustered around the wreckage, surrounded on three sides. Warpath Flight has the picture, she transmitted. Bravo 6, mark your perimeter. We are engaging. Reeves did not have smoke grenades left. He did not have infrared strobes. What he had was his voice in the SATCOM radio that Drake had kept alive through the entire battle. Warpath Bravo 6. Friendlies are clustered around the downed Black Hawk at the center of the LZ. Everything outside a 50-meter radius of the wreckage is hostile. You are cleared hot on all targets beyond that perimeter. Copy Bravo 6, 50 meters. Cleared hot. The Apaches split. Warpath 1 banked north to engage the main assault force. Warpath 2 swung east. The M230 chain gun erupted in a stream of 30-millimeter rounds that walked across the northern approach. Taliban fighters caught in the open were eliminated by an aircraft they had not prepared for. Karimi had planned for the A-10, but not for Apaches. The gunship's thermal saw everything, every fighter behind a rock, every mortar crew in a gully, every group of men gathering for the next rush. Warpath 2 engaged the eastern fighters with Hydra 70 rockets that slammed into the rubble field, sending columns of smoke and stone into the darkening sky. On the ground, the effect was immediate and total. The coordinated assault that had been seconds from overrunning the American position collapsed in under 90 seconds. Fighters who had been charging toward the crash site turned and ran, seeking cover from an enemy that could see through walls of stone and kill from a mile away. Mortar crews abandoned their weapons. The southern blocking force that had been advancing on Warren's position melted back into the rocks. Mercer lowered his M203 and watched the Apache's chain guns systematically eliminate the fighters who had been trying to kill him for the past hour. His face held no satisfaction, no triumph, just the profound exhaustion of a man whose body had been running on adrenaline for so long that the sudden absence of immediate danger felt like a kind of vertigo. "About damn time," he said quietly. But the battle was not over. Not completely. Not for Faisal Karimi. The old warrior stood in his command position on the upper canyon wall and watched his army disintegrate around him. The Apaches were doing what American air power always did, turning superior numbers and favorable terrain into meaningless advantages through the application of overwhelming technological violence. His fighters were dying or running. His ambush had been broken. His carefully constructed kill zone had become his own trap. Another man might have surrendered. Another man might have fled through the mountain passes he knew better than any American ever could, disappearing into the Hindu Kush to fight another day. Karimi had done exactly that a dozen times before, melting into the landscape like snow into spring earth, reappearing months or years later to strike again. But something was different today. Perhaps it was the magnitude of what he had invested, 6 months of planning destroyed in 90 seconds. Perhaps it was the weariness of a man who had been at war for 40 years and had finally reached the place where the fighting ends. Or perhaps Faisal Karimi, who had buried 2 sons and a brother in the soil of these mountains, who had survived everything 4 decades of war could throw at a single human being, had simply decided that this canyon, this battle, this day, would be where his war ended. He picked up his AK-47, the same model he had carried since the Americans first gave it to him in 1985, through a Pakistani intermediary in a training camp near Peshawar where young CIA officers had taught young Afghan fighters how to destroy Soviet helicopters. The weapon was worn smooth by decades of handling, its wooden stock scarred and darkened by sweat and blood and the oil of countless cleanings. It was as much a part of him as his hands. He gathered his last fighters, 10 men, his most loyal, his most experienced, the ones who had followed him through every battle and every retreat and every cold night in the mountains. They did not need to be told what he intended. They could see it in his eyes. This was the final charge, the last act of a war that had consumed their lives. Karimi spoke to them in Pashto, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had long since stopped needing to raise it. "We go now. Not to win, not to capture. We go because this is who we are. This is what we have always been. Warriors. And warriors do not hide when the end comes." They nodded. Some touched their hearts. One whispered a prayer. Then they moved. The 10 fighters descended from the canyon wall through a route only Karimi knew, emerging on the canyon floor 200 meters north of the crash site. They advanced through the rocks at a speed that belied their exhaustion, Karimi leading from the front with his AK held low. Warpath 1 spotted them, But Karimi had chosen his approach through a narrow gap where the Apache could not engage without risking fire into the American perimeter. The 50-meter safety radius became his shield. Warpath 1, I have 10 hostiles inside the safety radius, enclosing on the crash site, the Apache pilot transmitted. I cannot engage without risk to friendlies. Bravo 6, you've got 10 fighters inbound from the north, 50 meters out. They're inside our engagement limits. Reeves heard the warning and turned north. Through the smoke and dust that still hung in the canyon air, he could see them. Dark shapes moving through the rocks with a purpose and discipline that was different from the disorganized assault they had weathered minutes before. These men were not running at the perimeter in a desperate charge. They were advancing with the coordinated precision of professionals, and leading them was a figure that Reeves could distinguish even at this distance. Taller than the others, moving with a slight limp but with an authority that radiated outward like heat from a fire. The commander, the man who had orchestrated every element of this ambush, from the Claymore on the ridge to the SA-7 missiles that brought down Dust-Off 72. The man who had been trying to kill them all day. Contact north. 10 fighters inside the Apache's safety limit. We have to handle this ourselves. Cole had already seen them. The sniper had shifted his position to the northern edge of the wreckage and was scanning the approaching fighters through his scope. He had 2 rounds remaining for the Mk-13. 2 bullets, 10 targets. The mathematics were familiar by now. Insufficient, impossible. But among those 10 targets was one that mattered more than the others. The commander. Take the head and the body dies. It was the oldest principle of counter-leadership targeting, and Cole had practiced it in theory and in blood across 5 deployments. He found Karimi in his scope. The old fighter was moving with a purpose that Cole recognized, with the empathy of one warrior for another. This was not a man trying to win. This was a man choosing his ending. Cole had seen that look before, in the eyes of cornered animals in the Montana wilderness and in the eyes of fighters on previous battlefields. The look of a living thing that has decided where and how it will stop living. But recognition did not change the equation. The man in his scope was trying to kill his teammates, and that made the calculations simple. Cole tracked Karimi as the commander moved between rocks, waiting for a clean shot. The range was 80 meters and closing. Wind in the canyon was swirling, 12 miles per hour from the left, but gusting unpredictably as the storm front pushed cold air down through the mountain passes. At 80 meters with the Mk-13, the wind correction was minimal, but it existed, and with only 2 rounds remaining, there was no margin for a miss. Around Cole, the rest of the team engaged the other fighters. Reeves and Drake fired at the advancing shadows, dropping 2 in quick succession. Mercer fired his 4th M203 grenade into a cluster of fighters, and the explosion scattered 3 more, killing one and sending the others tumbling behind cover. Warren, from the wreckage, fired his pistol at a fighter who appeared on the western edge of the perimeter, the rounds sparking off rock but forcing the man back. But Karimi kept coming. He moved through the chaos of the firefight with an almost supernatural calm, advancing while his men provided covering fire, using the rocks and the confusion and the 50-meter safety radius to shield himself from the Apaches overhead. He was 40 meters from the crash site now, 35, closing on the position where Sandoval lay unconscious and where Bishop was treating Warren's shattered legs. Cole tracked him. The scope's crosshairs settled on Karimi's chest, center mass, the most reliable target on a moving human being. But Karimi was moving, using the irregular terrain to change speed and direction with each step. Cole needed him to pause. 1 second of stillness, that was all. Karimi reached a low rock wall and dropped behind it to reload his magazine. For 1.3 seconds, his upper body was visible above the rock. Stationary, exposed. Cole exhaled half a breath. The crosshairs steadied. His finger took up the slack on the trigger with the slow, deliberate pressure of a man who had performed this exact action thousands of times. The Mk-13 fired. The round covered 80 meters in a fraction of a heartbeat. It struck Faisal Karimi in the center of his chest, just below the sternum, with the force of a sledgehammer concentrated on a surface the size of a fingertip. The impact drove through his body and exited through his back, carrying with it the last breath of a man who had been at war for longer than most of his enemies had been alive. Karimi fell behind the rock wall and did not rise. His AK-47, the one he had carried since 1985, clattered against the stone and lay still beside him. There was no dramatic final gesture, no last words. One moment Faisal Karimi existed, with all his history and tactical brilliance and grief for his buried sons. The next moment, he was a body on the ground in a canyon that had seen countless bodies over countless centuries. Cole chambered his final round, one bullet remaining. Karimi's surviving fighters saw their commander fall, and the last thread of cohesion that held them together snapped. Three continued fighting from pure momentum, firing their weapons in the direction of the Americans without aim or purpose. Two turned and ran, scrambling for the canyon walls and the escape routes that their commander had known but had chosen not to use. The rest simply stopped. Stopped firing, stopped advancing, stopped being soldiers. The war was over for them the moment it was over for the man who had led them into it. The Apaches finished what was left. Warpath 1 engaged the fleeing fighters with surgical chain gun bursts that chased them through the rocks. Warpath 2 swept the canyon walls one final time, its thermal cameras confirming that the remaining mortar positions had been abandoned, and the Zu-23 anti-aircraft guns sat unmanned in their cave emplacements. In less than 5 minutes from their arrival, the Apache gunships had transformed the battlefield from a desperate last stand into a secured perimeter. The fire that had been continuous for nearly 2 hours fell silent, and the silence was so sudden and so complete that it seemed louder than the guns had been. Drake stood at his position, weapons shouldered, scanning for threats that were no longer there. His hands were still steady. They would not begin shaking until hours later, when the adrenaline finally drained from his system and his body began to process what his mind had been too busy to acknowledge. He had killed men today. He had commanded a SEAL team. He had nearly shot his own team leader. He was 27 years old, and he had lived through more in the past 2 hours than most men experience in a lifetime. Reeves moved through the perimeter, checking each of his men, Cole sitting quietly behind his rifle, the scope still up, his face showing nothing except the flat exhaustion of a man who had emptied himself completely. Mercer lying against a rock, the M203 resting across his knees, his hands finally still after 90 minutes of constant motion. Blood from the arm wound he had sustained during his mortar assault had soaked through the field dressing and dried to a dark crust on his sleeve. Vega, propped against the tail boom where he had fought with a hole in his chest and refused to stop. His breathing was worse now, the improvised chest seal losing its adhesion, each inhale a wet rattle that sounded like something tearing inside him. His eyes were closed, but he was conscious, his fingers still wrapped around his weapon. Bishop, who had performed surgery with one arm under fire, who had treated 6 patients while bleeding from his own wound, who had refused to stop working even when his vision began to gray at the edges from blood loss. He was still working when Reeves reached him, applying a fresh bandage to Warren's legs, with hands that moved by muscle memory because conscious thought had become too expensive. And Warren, the pilot who could not walk and would never walk again in the same way, who had flown his helicopter into a canyon full of missiles because wounded men were waiting, who had fired his pistol from the wreckage of his aircraft to protect his unconscious crew chief. He lay in the cockpit where Drake had left him, the M9 still in his hand, his eyes open and aware despite the pain that must have been beyond description. "Are we winning?" Warren asked when Reeves appeared at the broken cockpit door. "We're going home," Reeves replied. "All of us. Because of you." "That's the job," Warren said. And then his eyes closed, not from death, but from the body's final surrender to pain and exhaustion, and the knowledge that the fighting was done and it was safe to stop being strong. The Chinook arrived 7 minutes after the Apaches, a massive CH-47F transport helicopter that descended into the landing zone with the careful precision of pilots who knew they were landing in a graveyard. The quick reaction force aboard, a platoon of Rangers from the 75th Ranger Regiment, poured out of the rear ramp before the wheels had fully settled. They spread across the perimeter in a defensive formation that would have been textbook if anyone had been watching with a training eye. But there was no one left to fight. The Rangers' medics descended on the wounded with the focused urgency of men trained for exactly this moment. They brought what the canyon had been missing for 2 hours: fresh blood products, surgical instruments, chest tubes, morphine, the tools that turned dying men into surviving men. Vega was the most critical. The Ranger medic who opened his body armor and saw the improvised chest seal made from a field dressing wrapper stop for 1 second and looked at Bishop with an expression that mixed horror and respect in equal measure. "You did this with one hand under fire?" Bishop did not answer. He was sitting against the fuselage with his eyes half closed, his remaining strength finally gone, the medic inside him satisfied that his patients were in better hands, and the man inside him allowed at last to be a patient himself. The evacuation took 11 minutes. Vega went first, carried up the Chinook's ramp by rangers who moved with urgent care. Warren next, accompanied by Park, the flight medic who refused to leave his pilot's side. Sandoval still unconscious. Bishop, who tried to walk to the helicopter and made it 6 steps before his legs gave out. Chen, who limped up the ramp on his own and sat down with the dazed expression of a man not yet sure he was alive. Then the SEALs. Drake helped Mercer up the ramp. Cole walked alone, his empty sniper rifle slung over his shoulder, and sat in a corner without speaking. Vega was already on HIV fluids, his chest being properly treated by the ranger medic. Reeves was last. He stood at the base of the Chinook's ramp and looked back at the canyon one final time. The wreckage of Dustoff 72 sat in the middle of the landing zone, broken and smoking, a testament to Warren's courage and the cost of rescue. The canyon walls rose on either side, scarred by cannon fire and rocket impacts, pockmarked by explosions that had altered the landscape permanently. Somewhere in the rocks, Faisal Karimi lay where Cole's bullet had put him, and around him the bodies of men who had followed him into his last battle. Reeves turned and walked up the ramp. The hydraulics whined as it closed behind him, sealing the interior of the Chinook from the canyon's cold air and the smell of cordite and blood that hung over the battlefield like a shroud. The helicopter lifted off. The canyon fell away below them, shrinking from a world into a wound, into a scar on the surface of the mountains. Snow was beginning to fall on the higher peaks, the storm finally arriving to cover the evidence of what had happened in the Valley of Shadows. Reeves sat on the metal floor of the Chinook with his back against the bulkhead and his team around him. Drake was beside Vega, holding the wounded man's hand. Cole sat alone in his corner, his eyes fixed on something that existed only inside his own head. Mercer had finally stopped talking, his silence more eloquent than any of his wisecracks had been. Bishop was unconscious, the ranger medic working on his shoulder with the focused intensity of a man trying to undo an hour of damage. Reeves reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the letter. The paper was damp with sweat and stained with blood, the ink blurred in places where moisture had found it, but the words were still legible. The words of a mother in Ohio who had written to a stranger and asked him to bring her son home. He looked at Drake. The young man was staring at Vega's face, watching for any change in his breathing, his own hand steady where it held his teammates. Drake felt Reeves's eyes and turned to meet them. The two men regarded each other across the cargo bay of the helicopter, across the distance between commander and subordinate, between veteran and first-timer, between the man who had made a promise and the boy who had become a man in the keeping of it. Reeves held up the letter. Drake saw it and his eyes widened. He recognized the handwriting even through the blood and sweat stains. His mother's careful school-teacher script, the letter she had never told him she sent. Reeves did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the letter itself did not already contain. He simply held it up so Drake could see it, and then he folded it carefully and placed it back in his pocket, against his heart, where it had been through every moment of the battle. Drake's eyes were bright. He turned back to Vega and did not look at Reeves again for the rest of the flight. He did not need to. Everything that needed to pass between them had been communicated in the space of 3 seconds, in the gesture of a blood-stained letter. 47 miles to the southeast, Elena Graves was dying in the sky. Her single remaining engine had been running on fumes for 6 minutes past the point where the fuel gauge had stopped registering. She was flying at minimum speed, at maximum altitude, using every trick that 3 years of combat flying and a lifetime of her father's stories had taught her about coaxing distance from a dying aircraft. She had shut down every non-essential system, every electronic device that drew power, every light and display that was not absolutely required for basic flight. She was navigating by compass and terrain recognition, the mountains below her familiar from hundreds of missions flown over the same tortured landscape. Bagram was still 31 miles ahead. She would not make it to Bagram. But she did not need Bagram. She needed flat ground. And 15 miles ahead, on a plateau that rose above the surrounding valleys, there was an abandoned firebase that had been used by the Army in 2008 and subsequently closed. The landing strip was unpaved, barely 500 meters long, and had not been maintained in years. But it was flat, and flat was all she needed. The engine coughed, a long, stuttering interruption in the steady roar that had been her companion for the past 2 hours. Elena felt the aircraft drop, and her stomach went with it. The engine caught again, ran rough for 3 seconds, then smoothed out. But the oil temperature gauge was pegged at maximum, and she could smell something burning in the cockpit that she identified as the scent of metal destroying itself. She had perhaps 2 minutes of engine life remaining. The abandoned firebase appeared on the horizon, a brown scar on the mountain plateau that looked impossibly small against the vastness of the Afghan landscape. Elena adjusted her approach angle, lowered her nose to trade altitude for airspeed, and began her final descent. There would be no go-around, no second attempt. The engine would give her one chance to put the aircraft on the ground, and after that, physics would make the decision for her. Her hydraulic system had failed completely 20 minutes ago. She was flying on manual reversion, on steel cables connecting controls directly to surfaces without hydraulic assistance. Every input required enormous physical force. Her arms ached, her shoulders burned, her hands were cramped into claws around the flight stick. The runway grew in her windscreen, short, rough, but flat. The engine quit at 400 feet. One final shudder, then silence. Elena was gliding now. 70,000 pounds descending toward Earth with no power and no options. The A-10 touched down hard. The emergency braking system fired, a one-shot pneumatic mechanism applying maximum pressure through compressed nitrogen. The aircraft decelerated violently. Wheels bounced and skidded across the rough surface. The aircraft stopped, 200 feet from the end of the runway. For 10 seconds, Elena sat in the cockpit and did nothing. She breathed, in and out, in and out. The simple act of living, which had not been guaranteed for the past 2 hours, resumed its place as the most natural thing in the world. Then the right engine, which had been shut down but was still hot from its final minutes of operation, erupted in flame. Fire crawled across the engine nacelle and began licking at the wing root, fed by residual fuel and hydraulic fluid that coated every surface of the damaged aircraft. Elena released her harness, grabbed her survival kit, and climbed out of the cockpit onto the wing. The metal was hot beneath her boots. She jumped to the ground, stumbled, caught herself, and ran. Behind her, the fire grew, consuming the aircraft that had saved 10 lives and brought her home. She stopped running at 100 meters and turned to watch. The A-10, tail number 820654, burned against the Afghan sky like a funeral pyre. The aircraft that had flown into a canyon of death, that had taken anti-aircraft fire and kept flying, that had delivered rockets and cannon fire with precision that defied its damage, that had bluffed an entire enemy force with nothing but engine noise and courage, was consumed by flames that painted the gray clouds in shades of orange and red. Elena sat down on those rocky ground and cried. Not from fear, not from relief, from the pure, overwhelming emotion of a human being who has passed through something that cannot be processed in real time. She cried for the men she had saved and for herself, for the pilot who had arrived too late at Korengal and spent 11 months carrying 3 lives she could not save. She cried until the tears ran out. Then she wiped her face, keyed her survival radio, and called for pickup. 8 months later, the Pentagon. Captain Elena Graves stood at attention in her dress blues, the distinguished flying cross hanging from its ribbon around her neck. The citation described her actions in clinical language that reduced 2 hours of desperate combat to a paragraph of bureaucratic prose. Words like extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for personal safety appeared in the text, accurate but insufficient, like describing the ocean as a body of water. She stood before the audience and looked at the front row. They were all there, every one of them. Andre Bishop sat with his left arm in a therapeutic sling, the shoulder reconstructed in 3 surgeries that had restored partial function, but would never return to full strength. He had requested reassignment to the Naval Special Warfare Training Command, where he would teach the next generation of SEAL combat medics the skills that had kept 2 men alive in a canyon far from any hospital. His students would learn from the best because the best had learned the hardest way possible. Tomas Vega sat beside Bishop, breathing normally for the first time in months. His lung had been repaired in surgery at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, followed by 6 months of rehabilitation that had restored 85% of his pulmonary function. He had received an honorable medical discharge and accepted a position at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, where where his fluency in Pashto and his understanding of Afghan culture would be passed on to intelligence specialists and special operations linguists. He wore civilian clothes to the ceremony because his uniform no longer fit a body that had been reshaped by trauma and recovery. Kyle Mercer sat with his leg extended in front of him, the limb that had taken shrapnel during the battle, now permanently altered by nerve damage that gave him a slight limp he would carry for the rest of his life. He had been offered a medical discharge and had declined it with language that the reviewing board had described as colorful. He was still on active duty, still serving, still finding ways to make explosive devices do things their designers had never intended. When asked about his limp, he told people he had gotten it dancing at a wedding. No one who knew the truth ever contradicted him. Nathan Cole sat at the end of the row. He had submitted his resignation 2 months after the battle, ending a 15-year career. He had gone home to Montana, taken a job at a woodworking shop in Kalispell, learning to use his hands for creation instead of destruction. At the ceremony, he wore a dark suit that did not quite fit, and his hands, the hands that had fired the bullet that killed Karimi, rested quietly in his lap. Ryan Drake sat in the center of the front row, and beside him sat a woman in her late 50s with brown hair touched by gray and eyes that were red from crying before the ceremony even began. Margaret Drake, school teacher from Westerville, Ohio, had flown to Washington at the Navy's expense to watch her son receive the Bronze Star with Combat V for valor in the face of the enemy. Drake had been promoted to Petty Officer First Class following the deployment, the youngest member of his team elevated by actions that his commanding officers described as demonstrating leadership and tactical judgment, far exceeding his rank and experience. Drake held his mother's hand through the entire ceremony. When Elena's citation was read, Margaret Drake began crying again, and her son put his arm around her shoulders and held her the way she had held him when he was a boy. The letter she had written to Reeves was not mentioned in any citation or official record, but it existed in the space between the two of them and in the breast pocket of the dress uniform worn by the man sitting 2 seats away. Daniel Reeves sat in his dress whites with every ribbon earned in 18 years across his chest. He had finally disclosed his TBI to Naval Medical, a decision that ended his operational career. He would not lead another SEAL team into combat, but he had accepted a position as senior instructor at Bud/S in Coronado, where he would train the men who would carry on the work he could no longer do. He would teach them that the measure of a leader is not what he accomplishes when everything works. It is what he does when everything breaks. Beside him sat Rebecca, his wife, her hand on his knee, and Lily, 6 years old, sat in his father's lap, playing with the gold trident pin on his chest. When Reeves had returned to Virginia Beach, Lily had been waiting at the airport terminal. She had broken free from her mother's hand and run down the corridor toward him with the absolute faith of a child who had never doubted that her father would come home. Reeves had dropped to his knees and caught her, and he had held her against his chest and cried for the first time since he was 18 years old. Not from pain, not from relief. From the overwhelming truth that he had almost not come home, that the letter from Drake's mother could just as easily have been the letter from his own daughter, and that the only reason he was kneeling in that airport instead of lying in that canyon was because a pilot he had never met had refused to leave, and a young man from Ohio had refused to quit. Captain James Warren sat in a wheelchair at the end of the front row. His legs were encased in external fixation devices, metal frames and pins that held shattered bones in alignment while they healed. He would walk again, the surgeons had told him, but not the way he had walked before. Not the way a man walks who does not think about walking. His gait would be altered, mechanical, a constant reminder of the moment he had chosen to fly into a canyon full of missiles. When the ceremony ended and the officials had shaken hands and the photographers had taken their pictures, a reporter asked Warren if he had any regrets about his decision to enter the canyon without Apache escort. Warren looked at the reporter for a long moment. Then he looked at the row of men and women sitting in the front row, the men he had come to save, the men who had saved him in return. "I would fly into that canyon again tomorrow," he said. "That is what Dustoff does. That is what we have always done. We go because they need us. Everything else is just details." The ceremony ended. The officials dispersed. The families said their goodbyes in the careful way that people say goodbye when the bonds between them were forged in a place most people will never visit. Elena stood in the hallway and watched them leave. She saw Drake walking with his mother, Mercer limping toward the elevator, Cole slipping away through a side door, heading back to Montana. She saw Reeves. He was standing at the end of the hallway with Lily on his hip and Rebecca at his side. He saw Elena watching and held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, a single small movement of his head that contained everything that could not be spoken. Thank you for staying, for fighting, for refusing to leave, for giving me the chance to stand here with my daughter in my arms. Elena nodded back. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, toward the sunlight that spilled through the glass doors of the Pentagon, toward the car that would take her to Andrews Air Force Base, and toward the aircraft that waited for her there. A new A-10, different tail number, same titanium cockpit, same GAU-8 cannon, same smell of hydraulic fluid and ozone and purpose. She had received her orders that morning. Redeployment to Bagram, another rotation in Afghanistan. Elena climbed into the cockpit and settled into the seat that had become more familiar than any chair she had ever owned. She reached into her flight bag and pulled out a photograph. Not the photo of her father that had burned with the wreckage. A new one given to her that morning by Reeves. It showed the front row of the ceremony. All of them. Bishop with his sling, Vega in his civilian clothes, Mercer with his crooked grin, Cole with his quiet eyes, Drake with his mother, Reeves with Lily, Warren in his wheelchair. And at the edge of the frame, Elena herself standing at attention with the medal around her neck and tears she had not known she was shedding running silently down her face. She taped the photograph to the instrument panel next to where her father's picture had once been. Two images now, the old war and the new. The father who had not survived his, and the daughter who was still finding her way through hers. The radio crackled. Lightning 6, Bagram Tower, you are cleared for takeoff. Elena looked at the photograph one last time. Then she placed her hands on the throttles, felt the familiar vibration of the engines through her seat, and pushed forward. The A-10 rolled down the runway, gathering speed, and lifted into the sky. Lightning 6 is airborne, ready for tasking. Below her, the world turned. Above her, the sky was clear and blue and endless. And somewhere in the mountains ahead, in the valleys and canyons and ridgelines that stretched toward the horizon, someone might be waiting. Someone who needed her. Someone she would not be too late for. Not this time. Not ever again. I spent weeks researching this story, and the moment that still haunts me is that letter from Drake's mother. She wrote 5 simple sentences to a man she never met, asking him to bring her boy home. Every parent who ever watched their child leave for war knows that feeling. I kept asking myself, what would you do if you were Reeves, carrying that letter in your pocket while bullets are flying? Or Elena, disobeying a direct order because leaving meant letting 6 men die? Drop your answer below. I read every single comment. And if this story hit you the way it hit me, stick around. The next one is going to be even harder to forget.